July 1976. Thatched house lodge, Richmond Park. The hottest summer in a generation, and the windows are open onto the deer park. Sir Angus Ogilvy sits in his study with a government report on the desk in front of him. It is bound, printed, and addressed to Parliament. His name appears on page after page, attached to the words negligent and severe criticism. In the hallway, his wife is adjusting her hat. Princess Alexandra, the Queen's cousin, is leaving for an engagement, a hospital visit, a regimental lunch, the kind of appearance she has performed without interruption for 13 years. She will smile, she will be warm, she will not mention the report. Upstairs, the children are home for the summer. James is 12, Marina is 10. They will not be told what the inspectors found. Nobody in this house will discuss it with anyone, including each other. The family that lived in that house had been admired for a generation. A beautiful princess and her well-bred husband. 2 children. A home inside a royal park. They looked from the outside like the establishment at its most elegant and its most secure. What the inspector's report had just made public was how much of that security was built on silence, and how much the silence had cost. This is the story of Princess Alexandra, Sir Angus Ogilvy, and the scandal that followed them for 40 years. A royal marriage, a corporate disaster, a daughter's public rebellion, and the code of British establishment composure that held the surface together while everything underneath it fractured. It is the story of what happens to the people inside the facade when the facade is the only thing they are permitted to maintain. To understand how a family built on duty, discretion, and centuries of service to the crown came to be touched by one of the ugliest corporate scandals in modern British history, you have to go back further than the boardroom, further than the company, further than the man whose name appeared in the inspector's report. You have to go back to 2 families, one royal, one aristocratic, and the particular codes each taught its children about what mattered, what was owed, and what must never, under any circumstances, be spoken of in public. The first family is Windsor by blood and Kent by title. Princess Alexandra, Victoria Alberta, Edwina Louise Daphne was born on Christmas Day, 1936, at Thrid Belgrave Square in London, the daughter of Prince George, Duke of Kent, and Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark. Her arrival carried a specific meaning inside the royal architecture of the time. She was not close enough to the throne to bear its weight. She was close enough to be useful. That distinction, useful but not central, visible but not sovereign, would define every decade of her life. Her father, Prince George, was the 4th son of King George V. He was handsome, cultured, cosmopolitan in ways that made certain corners of the court uneasy, and devoted to Marina in a marriage that appeared, by the standards of the family, genuinely affectionate. Alexandra was 5 years old when he was killed. On August 25th, 1942, the RAF Short Sunderland flying boat carrying the Duke of Kent crashed into a hillside at Eagles Rock in Caithness, Scotland. In poor weather, everyone on board died except the rear gunner. The official cause was pilot error. The unofficial questions lingered for decades. What mattered to Alexandra's formation was not the conspiracy theories. It was the absence. She lost her father at 5. Her brother Edward, the new Duke of Kent, was 6. Her younger brother Michael was 7 weeks old. Marina, widowed at 35, with 3 young children and a position inside the royal family that depended partly on a husband who was no longer there, did what women of her class and era were trained to do. She composed herself. She dressed impeccably. She continued. That response, composed grief, immaculate public presentation, private sorrow compressed into something manageable, became Alexandra's inheritance as surely as the apartments and the proximity to the crown. Marina transmitted a particular emotional style, beauty worn like armor, sadness carried without visible fracture, duty performed as though it were breath rather than effort. Alexandra absorbed it completely. She would carry it for 80 years. The girl grew up in the diminished but still formidable world of a widowed royal duchess. Coppins, the family's country house in Buckinghamshire, and later Kensington Palace. Education at Heathfield, a boarding school in Ascot, which made her the first British princess educated at what the press called an ordinary school. Though Heathfield was ordinary only in the sense that it was not a palace schoolroom, the faint modern gloss was enough for the newspapers. The deeper code, restraint, service, the suppression of private feeling in the interest of public composure remained untouched. By the time Alexandra entered public life as a young woman, she had already learned the lesson that would govern everything. The monarchy needed her to be reliable. Not brilliant, not controversial, not original, reliable. She would perform engagements. She would smile. She would represent the sovereign abroad in her home with a warmth that was genuine but never disruptive. She would be, in the quiet taxonomy of royal usefulness, one of the family's safest assets. That stability would last decades, and then it would collide with a man, a company, and a scandal that made safety impossible. The second family is Ogilvy by name and Airlie by title, and their roots run as deep into the Scottish establishment as Alexandra's run into the European royal houses. The Ogilvys held Airlie Castle and Cordichi Castle in the county of Angus. Their service to the crown was not occasional, but structural. Angus's grandmother, Mabel, Countess of Airlie, had served Queen Mary as a lady-in-waiting and intimate companion for decades. His father, David Ogilvy, the 12th Earl of Airlie, served as Lord Chamberlain to Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. His elder brother David would later serve as Lord Chamberlain to Queen Elizabeth II, and that brother's wife, Virginia, would serve as one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting. This was not a family that married into court culture. This was a family that lived inside it, generation after generation, as naturally as they lived inside their castles. Angus James Bruce Ogilvy was born on September 14, 1928. He was the second son. That detail matters more than almost any other single fact in his biography, because it is the engine that drove everything that followed. The earldom, the estates, the castles, the hereditary position, all of it would pass to his elder brother. Angus would have the name, the education, the connections, the manners, and the expectations. He would not have the inheritance. He went to Eton. He served in the Scots Guards. He read philosophy, politics, and economics at Trinity College, Oxford. He reportedly wanted to become an architect, a detail that carries a faint poignancy in retrospect because it suggests a creative ambition that was never pursued. The social logic of his world pushed him instead toward the city of London, where a well-connected younger son with the right schooling and the right clubs could build something that looked from the outside like independent distinction. It was never quite independent. It was always tethered to the world that had produced him, the world of landed families, court service, hereditary honor, and the unspoken understanding that certain standards must be maintained regardless of whether the money to maintain them was actually there. By his late 20s, Angus was moving through the city with ease. He was tall, handsome, socially assured, and equipped with exactly the kind of establishment credentials that opened boardroom doors in post-war Britain. He became associated with the Drayton Group, the investment empire built by Holly Drayton, and through that association, he accumulated directorships at a pace that reflected both his ability and his connections. By the mid-1960s, the Drayton Group was said to be worth around £160 million, and Angus sat on scores of company boards in that orbit. He was becoming, in the language of his class, a serious man of business. Not a speculator, not an adventurer, a director, a steward, a man whose presence on a board was meant to signal probity. There is something about that word, improbity, that is worth sitting with for a moment. It was the currency Angus traded in. His value to the companies he served was not primarily technical or operational, it was reputational. He brought the assurance of old money, old family, and proximity to the crown. His name on a board was a signal that the enterprise was respectable. That signal would prove to be both his greatest asset and the instrument of his destruction. The two families converged in the early 1960s. The engagement of Princess Alexandra and Angus Ogilvy was announced on November 19, 1962. To the public and to the press, it was almost absurdly satisfying. A beautiful royal princess marrying a handsome Scottish aristocrat with impeccable connections and a serious career. The wedding on April 24, 1963, at Westminster Abbey, was attended by the core royal family and watched by an estimated 200 million television viewers worldwide. Alexandra wore a dress of magnolia lace by John Kavanagh. Angus, in morning dress, looked precisely like what he was, a man born to occupy the foreground of British establishment life. One detail from the engagement period deserves attention. Angus declined the offer of an earldom on marriage. The Queen had offered to create him a peer, as was customary for men who married into the royal family. He said no. That refusal can be read two ways simultaneously, and both readings are true. It was modest. He did not want to be known as the man who acquired a title through marriage, and it was ambitious. He did not want his public identity reduced to royal consort. He wanted to remain Angus Ogilvy, businessman. He wanted to be known for what he built, not whom he married. That insistence on an independent professional life is the hinge of the entire story. It is the reason he sat on the boards. It is the reason he was at Lonrho. It is the reason the scandal, when it came, carried the particular devastation that it did. Their household took shape quickly. James Ogilvy was born on February 29th, 1964, a leap year child at Thatched House Lodge in Richmond Park, the Crown Estate property that would be the family's home for decades. Marina Ogilvy followed on July 31st, 1966. The house itself is worth understanding as a setting because it embodied the family's position with unusual precision. Thatched House Lodge sits inside Richmond Park, a royal park managed by the Crown. It is beautiful, private, surrounded by parkland and deer, and it is not quite theirs. It is a grace and favor residence, which means it is occupied by permission rather than by ownership. That arrangement, domestic comfort inside institutional architecture, privacy that is always partly borrowed, mirrors the family's larger situation exactly. They lived inside the monarchy's protective structure. They could not step outside it without consequences, and they could not fully control what happened when the outside world, with its rougher rules, pressed in. The years between 1963 and the early 1970s were, by every visible measure, the best years. Alexandra became one of the hardest working members of the extended royal family, undertaking tours, patronages, and engagements at a pace that quietly outstripped many of her more prominent relatives. She was good at it in the way that the best supporting royals are good at it, warmly, competently, without drama. Angus, meanwhile, built his city portfolio into something formidable. The directorships multiplied, the reputation solidified. The couple appeared at the right events, lived in the right house, educated their children with the right mixture of royal privilege and relative normality. The public image was coherent, attractive, and apparently indestructible. Beneath it, the contaminant had already entered. In 1961, 2 years before the wedding, Angus visited South Africa on business. During that visit, he encountered Roland Walter Voorhoop, known to the world as Tiny Rowland. Rowland was a German-born, Rhodesian-raised businessman of extraordinary energy, charm, and ruthlessness. He had been running mining and ranching interests in Rhodesia with considerable success, and he was looking for a larger platform. Angus helped persuade Rowland to join the London and Rhodesian Mining and Land Company, Lonrho. It was a decision that looked at the time like exactly the sort of thing a sharp-eyed city man should do. Identify talent, connect it to capital, and watch the returns grow. Lonrho's profits rose dramatically under Rowland's leadership. The company expanded across Africa with an appetite that was impressive, relentless, and in hindsight, reckless. Rowland was everything Angus was not. Where Angus was courteous, Rowland was confrontational. Where Angus relied on the quiet signals of establishment trust, Rowland relied on speed, aggression, and an almost physical dominance of any room he entered. He was brilliant. He was also dangerous, not in the criminal sense, but in the deeper sense that he did not recognize the boundaries that governed polite British capitalism, sanctions, shell companies, political entanglements in newly independent African states, payments that moved through channels designed to avoid scrutiny. These were tools to Rowland, not transgressions. And the further Lonrho expanded under his direction, the more the company became a vessel for practices that the British establishment could tolerate privately, but not defend publicly. Angus sat on the Lonrho board. He was a non-executive director, which meant his role was oversight rather than operations. That distinction would later become his defense and simultaneously his indictment. He was supposed to be watching, The question that the next decade would force into the open was brutally simple. What did he see? That question would not stay private. But before it broke into public view, the family lived inside a social world that deserves rendering, because that world explains both the heights from which they fell and the particular texture of the fall. The London of the 1960s that Angus and Alexandra inhabited was a city where power still moved largely through family, school, regiment, and club. The corridors that connected a Pall Mall dining room to a Threadneedle Street boardroom to a Kensington Palace drawing room were not metaphorical. They were physical, walked by the same men in the same suits carrying the same assumptions about how Britain worked. Angus moved through those corridors with the ease of a man who had been raised inside them. He belonged to the right clubs. He sat on the right boards. He attended the right dinners. His wife's proximity to the sovereign added a luster that no amount of commercial success alone could have provided, and he was shrewd enough to know it even as he insisted that his career stood on its own merits. Alexandra, meanwhile, occupied a different but parallel corridor. The court circular recorded her engagements with the regularity of a metronome. She opened hospitals, attended regimental dinners, toured Commonwealth nations, lent her name to charities and institutions, whose work she followed with a conscientiousness that surprised those who expected royal patronage to be decorative and nothing more. She was not decorative. She was diligent, warm in a manner that colleagues described as genuine rather than performed, and possessed of a particular talent for making the people she met feel that her attention was real. In the taxonomy of royal duty, she was a workhorse. She never complained about it publicly. She never appeared to resent it. Whether she resented it privately is a question that the family's code of silence makes impossible to answer with certainty. What the public saw in those years was a portrait of complementary success: the princess and the businessman, the crown's reliable cousin and the city's well-bred director, two children growing up in a beautiful house in a royal park. Engagements fulfilled, accounts maintained, appearances kept. It was the kind of marriage that the British establishment produced with regularity in that era. Not passionate, not tortured, not the stuff of novels, but functional, respectable, and seemingly durable. The children grew up inside that structure. James, the elder, was by temperament the more reserved, a boy who absorbed the household's unspoken rules about privacy and composure and appeared to accept them as natural. Marina, 2 years younger, was different. She was more volatile, more visible in her feelings, less instinctively aligned with the family's preference for surface calm. That difference would not matter for years. When it did matter, it would matter enormously. But in the mid-1960s, both children were simply small, well-dressed inhabitants of a world that had not yet shown them its capacity for humiliation. Tiny Rowland, meanwhile, was turning Lonrho into something unprecedented. Under his leadership, the company expanded from its original base in Rhodesian mining into a sprawling African conglomerate with interests in gold, copper, sugar, textiles, newspapers, oil pipelines, and property across dozens of countries. By the early 1970s, Lonrho had become one of the most widely established companies in post-independence Africa. Its reach was extraordinary. So was the political complexity of its operations. Rowland cultivated relationships with African heads of state, some democratic, some autocratic, some shifting between the two, and moved through the continent with a freedom that older, more cautious British firms found both enviable and alarming. The alarm was not merely commercial. Rhodesia, under Ian Smith's government, had issued a unilateral declaration of independence in 1965, and the British government had responded with economic sanctions. Those sanctions created a peculiar moral and legal landscape for any British company with Rhodesian interests. To maintain operations in Rhodesia was to risk association with a regime that the British government publicly condemned. To abandon operations was to forfeit profitable assets. Most companies managed this tension quietly, through restructuring, through subsidiary arrangements, through the kind of corporate architecture designed to create distance between a London board and an embarrassing African reality. Lonrho was not most companies. Under Rowland, the line between compliance and circumvention was thinner than the establishment wanted to acknowledge, and certainly thinner than a royal family member's husband could afford. Angus's position on the Lonrho board placed him at the intersection of these pressures. He was a non-executive director. He attended meetings. He received papers. He lent his name and his connections to an enterprise whose African dimensions were growing more politically dangerous with each passing year. Whether he understood the full extent of what Rowland was doing, the payments, the arrangements, the structures designed to move money and influence through channels that avoided scrutiny, is a question that would eventually be answered not by Angus himself, but by government inspectors. There is a particular kind of danger that belongs to the well-connected man who sits on boards as a signal of respectability rather than as an operational force. His presence tells the world that the company is sound. His ignorance, if it is ignorance, tells no one anything, because ignorance in a non-executive director is indistinguishable from negligence until an inspector draws the line. Angus was about to discover where that line was drawn and what it cost to have been on the wrong side of it, but not yet. In the mid-1960s, the family was still whole, still admired, still performing its double act of royal duty and commercial respectability with apparent ease. James was learning to walk in the gardens of Thatched House Lodge. Marina was a baby in a household that smelled of cut flowers and old furniture and the faintly institutional air of a crown property. Alexandra was fulfilling her engagements with a discipline that would, across the decades, make her one of the longest-serving working royals in British history. Angus was building the career that he believed would define him on his own terms. The terms, however, were not his to set. They belonged to the company, to the man who ran it, to the government that would eventually investigate it, and to the merciless arithmetic of public reputation. The arithmetic that says a name, once stained, cannot be unstained by later findings, later apologies, or later silence. There is a ghost thread running through this story that belongs to Princess Marina, the Duchess of Kent, Alexandra's mother. Marina had been born into the Greek and Danish royal families, raised in exile, possessed of a beauty that the British press adored, and a bearing that conveyed aristocratic discipline so thoroughly it was almost indistinguishable from coldness. She was not cold, she was controlled. The difference matters because it is the difference Alexandra inherited. Marina lost her husband to a wartime crash and spent the next 26 years as a widow inside the royal family, present at coronations, visible at state occasions, occupying Kensington Palace with the composed sadness of a woman who had learned that grief in her world was a private matter that must never be permitted to inconvenience the institution. She died in August 1968, aged 61. Alexandra was 31. The loss was not sudden in the way her father's death had been, but it removed the last buffer between Alexandra and the full weight of her position. With Marina gone, Alexandra was no longer someone's daughter inside the royal structure. She was simply herself, a working princess, a mother, a wife whose husband's business life was about to become the most dangerous thing about her. On Angus's side, the family architecture was equally legible to anyone who knew how to read it. David Ogilvy, the 12th Earl of Airlie, embodied a standard of aristocratic service that was both admirable and, in its way, imprisoning. The Airlie estates in Angus were not merely property, they were identity. To be an Ogilvy of Airlie was to occupy a place in Scottish and British life that had been defined by centuries of loyalty to the crown, military service, and the management of land. Angus's mother, Lady Alexandra Coke, brought another layer of aristocratic density to the household. She was the daughter of the 3rd Earl of Leicester, connected to the Holcombe Hall estate in Norfolk, and to the wider web of English landed families that intersected with the Scottish peerage through marriage, education, and shared assumptions about how life should be conducted. Angus grew up inside a world where family honor was always collective. A single member's disgrace was everyone's disgrace. That understanding was not taught explicitly. It did not need to be. It was absorbed through the texture of daily life, in a house where portraits of ancestors lined the walls, and the family name was inscribed in the stone of the local church. The values that both families transmitted to their children can be stated simply, though their consequences were not simple at all. Do not embarrass the institution. Do not over-explain. Do not perform panic, absorb damage privately, carry on publicly. Alexandra mastered that code so completely that it became invisible. She appeared to be naturally composed rather than rigorously disciplined. Angus, for a long time, appeared to live comfortably inside it. The tragedy of this family is that the same code that made them look solid also made genuine transparency nearly impossible once the scandal arrived. The machinery designed to preserve dignity would, in the end, preserve the appearance of dignity, while the reality underneath buckled under pressures it was never designed to withstand. Three things needed to converge for disaster. First, the royal family needed Alexandra to remain symbolically clean, untouched by controversy, available for duty, unmarked by the kind of scandal that could make her a liability rather than an asset. Second, Angus needed a serious business life of his own, because without it, he was merely a consort, a decorative appendage to a cousin of the sovereign, and that was not a role his pride or his upbringing could accept. Third, the post-imperial British business world in Africa, where old establishment assumptions about honor, deference, and gentlemanly conduct met the raw realities of extraction, sanctions, and political instability, was precisely the arena where those assumptions were least adequate to what was actually happening on the ground. All three conditions were in place by the late 1960s, and beneath the polished surface of the best years, something was already shifting. The social world that surrounded the family in this period is worth dwelling on because it would soon become the stage for a very public humiliation. Angus and Alexandra moved through a Britain where the establishment, the word itself had only recently been popularized by Henry Fairley in a 1955 Spectator article, still functioned as an informal but powerful network of shared assumptions. A man who had been to Eton, served in the Guards, read PPE at Oxford, and married a princess did not need to explain himself. His credentials were legible to every other member of the network. His presence on a company board was understood as a form of endorsement that required no elaboration. This system worked beautifully as long as the companies themselves behaved within the boundaries that the establishment recognized. When they did not, and when the money came from places that polite conversation preferred not to examine, when the African operations involved arrangements that could not survive parliamentary scrutiny, the man who had lent his name discovered that the establishment's loyalty to its own was conditional on the embarrassment remaining manageable. Angus did not see this coming. Perhaps no one in his position could have. The city of the 1960s was not designed to question its own assumptions. Boards met in paneled rooms. Minutes were recorded in measured prose. Directors were served tea. The atmosphere was one of gentlemanly confidence, not forensic inquiry. A non-executive director in that world was expected to exercise judgment, not conduct investigations. He was expected to notice if something was obviously wrong. He was not expected to peer behind the curtain with the suspicion of an auditor. Angus Ogilvy was a product of this culture. He trusted it. He assumed that the systems in which he moved were fundamentally sound because they had been sound for his father and his grandfather and the generations before them. That assumption was the most expensive mistake of his life. What makes the story more than a simple tale of corporate negligence is the royal dimension. Any other director criticized in a Department of Trade report would have endured professional embarrassment and moved on. Angus could not move on because he was not merely a director. He was the husband of a princess. His reputation was not his alone. It belonged, in ways that he had always understood, but perhaps never fully reckoned with, to the institution that his wife served. When his name appeared in connection with sanctions busting, shell companies, and payments of questionable propriety, it was not just the name Ogilvy that was damaged. It was the extended Windsor brand. And that brand had guardians far more powerful and far less forgiving than any corporate board. The couple's domestic life at Thatched House Lodge continued through all of this with the regularity that Alexandra's temperament demanded. The children were growing. James, sturdy and self-contained, showed early signs of the quiet competence that would later define his adult life. Marina, more spirited, more emotionally transparent, was becoming the kind of child who tested boundaries, not dramatically, not dangerously, but with an energy that did not always sit comfortably inside a household built on restraint. The household itself was staffed, managed, ordered by the rhythms of royal adjacency. There were engagements to prepare for, cars arriving, Alexandra in the hall adjusting her hat, Angus in his study with the Financial Times, and the board papers that arrived in the thick manila envelopes from companies whose names his children would later read in very different contexts. It was, by every outward measure, a life of extraordinary privilege and apparent security. The house was beautiful, the park was ancient, the children were healthy, the marriage was intact. The directorships were multiplying. Alexandra was admired. Angus was respected. The family name and both family names carried exactly the weight they were supposed to carry. That weight was about to become a burden. And the first signal came not from a newspaper or a parliamentary question, but from a quiet conversation in Whitehall. The kind of conversation that never appears in official minutes because its purpose is precisely to ensure that certain problems are resolved before they become the sort of thing that requires official minutes. There is a pattern in British institutional life that this family story illustrates with painful clarity. The pattern is this: problems are identified early, addressed privately, and managed through networks of personal connection rather than formal process. A telephone call from the right person, a word over lunch, an understanding reached between gentlemen. This approach works as long as the problem remains within the system's control. When it escapes, when it reaches Parliament or the press or the inspectors, the same networks that manage the problem quietly now manage the distance between the institution and the person who has become embarrassing. The person is not destroyed. He is simply released from the protection that once surrounded him. The institution carries on. The individual absorbs the damage. Angus Ogilvy was about to become that individual. The first crack was about to appear. It would come from the Foreign Office, where a senior civil servant named Sir Dennis Greenhill had decided that the Crown could not afford to remain even tangentially connected to what was happening in Rhodesia. What Greenhill told Angus in 1968 would set in motion a chain of resignations, revelations, and reputational wounds that would follow the family for the rest of Angus's life. The safe marriage, the beautiful house, the dutiful princess, the respected businessman, all of it was about to meet the one force that British establishment discretion cannot withstand. Documentary evidence laid before Parliament with names attached. If this story has you as captivated as I think it has, do subscribe. What happened next to this family is something the public never knew. And we're only just beginning. In 1968, Sir Dennis Greenhill was the permanent Under-Secretary at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the most senior civil servant in the department, the man whose job it was to ensure that British foreign policy was implemented without the kind of embarrassments that required ministerial explanations. Greenhill was not a politician. He was an administrator, a diplomat, and in the particular way of the Whitehall Mandarin class, a guardian of institutional reputation. When he spoke to Angus Ogilvy that year, the conversation was not adversarial. It did not need to be. The message was clear enough without raised voices. The Crown could not be associated, even indirectly, with business interests in Rhodesia. The trigger was specific. Yeoman Investments, a company within the orbit of Angus's business interests, had acquired a stake in a Rhodesian copper mine. Angus later maintained that the purchase had been made without his knowledge. Whether that was true in the strictest sense, whether the papers had crossed his desk and been overlooked, or whether the transaction had genuinely been executed without his awareness, the effect was the same. A company connected to the husband of Princess Alexandra held an interest in a country under British sanctions, governed by a regime that the British government had publicly condemned. The symbolism was intolerable, not because the sum of money was enormous, not because the copper mine was strategically important, but because the connection, however indirect, threatened to draw the royal family into a political controversy from which it could not benefit and from which it might not easily escape. Angus resigned from all companies with Rhodesia connections. He did so quickly and, so far as the public record shows, without protest. The resignations were not widely reported at the time. They did not need to be. The system had worked as it was designed to work: a quiet word, a swift withdrawal, a problem contained before it could metastasize. Greenhill's intervention belongs in the story not because it was dramatic, but because it reveals the machinery operating beneath the surface. The Foreign Office did not issue a directive. It did not threaten. It simply made clear what the consequences of inaction would be. And Angus, who understood the codes of his world as fluently as anyone, acted accordingly. There is a scene worth imagining here, though the precise details of the conversation between Greenhill and Angus have never been made fully public. Two men, both products of the same establishment culture. Greenhill was Eton educated, an intelligence veteran, a man whose career had been spent navigating the space between government policy and the messy realities of its implementation. Angus was his social peer, perhaps his Eton contemporary, certainly his equal in the currency of establishment credentials. The conversation would not have been adversarial. It would have been conducted in the language of shared understanding, the language in which uncomfortable truths are delivered not as threats, but as observations, not as demands, but as descriptions of what any reasonable person in the same position would naturally choose to do. That language is one of the British establishment's most effective instruments of control. It allows power to be exercised without ever appearing to have been exercised. And it allows the person on the receiving end to maintain the fiction that his subsequent actions were taken freely, by his own judgment, rather than under the invisible pressure of institutional expectation. But there is a detail in this episode that carries a darker implication than the immediate crisis. The Greenhill conversation demonstrates that by 1968, the state apparatus had already identified Angus's business life as a potential source of royal embarrassment. The Crown's interest was not in Angus's welfare, it was in the Crown's own protection. The distinction matters profoundly because it means that from this point forward, every subsequent entanglement would be assessed not on its merits as a business matter, but on its capacity to damage the institution. Angus was no longer simply a businessman who happened to be married to a princess. He was a reputational liability to be managed, and the management would always prioritize the institution over the individual. Alexandra's response to the 1968 episode, like her response to every subsequent crisis, was silence and continuity. She was by this point deep into the rhythm of her public life, a rhythm that had become almost metronomic in its regularity. Foreign tours, domestic engagements, patronages, visits to hospitals and regiments and schools. The court circular recorded her movements with the bureaucratic precision of a logbook, and the logbook showed no interruption, no pause, no deviation. Whatever she knew about the Greenhill conversation, whatever anxiety she felt about the proximity of her husband's business life to the political minefield of Rhodesian sanctions, she price-tested in private and continued in public. That pattern, private absorption, public performance, was not new. It was the pattern her mother had taught her after her father's death. It was the pattern the entire royal system reinforced at every turn. And it was the pattern that over the next 3 decades would allow the family to survive crises that would have destroyed less disciplined households at a cost that would only become visible when the next generation began to crack. He did not appear to absorb this lesson fully, or perhaps he absorbed it and concluded that the Rhodesia episode was an anomaly, a specific problem tied to a specific political situation, now resolved, unlikely to recur. That conclusion would have been reasonable in 1968. It would prove catastrophic within 5 years. The early 1970s were a period of growing turbulence inside Lonrho, though the turbulence was not yet fully visible to those outside the boardroom. Tiny Rowland's management of the company had always been characterized by a certain autocratic energy. He made decisions swiftly, cultivated personal relationships with African political leaders, and treated the board less as a governing body than as an audience for his achievements. For a time, the returns justified this style. Lonrho's profits were impressive. Its expansion across Africa was the envy of competitors. Rowland was feted in the financial press and feared in the corporate world in roughly equal measure. He was the kind of businessman who made other businessmen uncomfortable precisely because his success seemed to depend on qualities, personal magnetism, political intuition, willingness to operate in gray areas that the British corporate establishment preferred to pretend did not matter. But inside the boardroom, the non-executive directors were becoming restive. The issues were not merely stylistic. There were questions about payments, about the use of company funds for purposes that did not appear in the annual accounts in the way that transparent corporate governance would have required. There were questions about Rowland's personal arrangements, his remuneration, his expenses, the degree to which the company's resources were being deployed in ways that served his interests rather than the shareholders. And there were questions about the Rhodesian operations that the 1968 crisis had not fully resolved because the company's African entanglements were not limited to a single copper mine. They were structural, woven into the fabric of an enterprise that depended on its ability to operate in countries where the rules were different from those that applied in the City of London. Angus was among the directors who had concerns by his account, and by the account preserved in the record of the boardroom struggle that followed. He was part of the faction that believed Rowland's leadership had become untenable, not because the company was unprofitable, but because its methods were unsustainable in the face of growing scrutiny. That is an important distinction. The non-executive directors were not objecting to success. They were objecting to the particular means by which success had been achieved, and to the personal power that Rowland had accumulated within the corporate structure. In 1973, the confrontation erupted. The non-executive directors, including Angus, moved to remove Tiny Rowland as managing director. It was a boardroom coup of the kind that the city understood, even if it rarely witnessed one conducted with such ferocity. Rowland fought back. He appealed directly to the shareholders, bypassing the board, making his case with the personal charisma and combative energy that had built the company in the first place. The shareholders sided with Rowland. The coup failed. The failure was humiliating for the non-executive directors, but what made it historically significant was what happened next. The boardroom battle attracted parliamentary attention. The scale of the questions being raised about Lonrho, the payments, the Rhodesian connections, the offshore arrangements, the treatment of minority shareholders, was too large to be contained within the company's own governance structures. On May 15, 1973, during a debate in the House of Commons, the Prime Minister, Edward Heath, described the Lonrho affair in a phrase that entered political history. The company, Heath said, represented the unpleasant and unacceptable face of capitalism. That sentence did something that no boardroom resolution could have done. It transformed Lonrho from a corporate controversy into a national moral question. The phrase was not merely critical, it was definitive. It named the company as an emblem of something rotten, not just in its own affairs, but in the broader culture of British capitalism that had permitted those affairs to flourish. And because the phrase came from a conservative prime minister, from the leader of the party that was supposed to be the natural defender of business interests, it carried an authority that no labor critique could have matched. Heath was not attacking capitalism itself. He was attacking the particular version of capitalism that Lonrho represented, or the version that operated without adequate oversight, that used African operations as a space beyond normal rules, that enriched its principles through arrangements that could not withstand daylight. Angus Ogilvy resigned from the Lonrho board in 1973 during the struggle to remove Rowland. The resignation was both principled and pragmatic. He had tried to dislodge Rowland and failed. Remaining on the board after that failure would have been untenable in practical terms and dangerous in reputational terms, but the resignation did not end his association with the scandal. It merely changed the nature of it. He was no longer a current director of a controversial company. He was a former director of an infamous one. And the investigation that would produce the most damaging assessment of his conduct was still 3 years away. The months following the Heath denunciation were a strange period for the family. Angus was no longer at Lonrho, but Lonrho was very much still attached to him. The newspapers had the phrase, the public had the association, and Alexandra, who had spent a decade building a reputation for quiet, unblemished duty, now found herself married to a man whose most prominent public identity was no longer the businessman who married a princess, but the director at the unacceptable face of capitalism. She did not comment publicly. She did not withdraw from engagements. She continued because continuing was what her entire life had trained her to do. But the balance inside the marriage had shifted. Angus was no longer the independent, self-made half of the partnership. He was the half that needed protecting. At Thatched House Lodge, the children were 9 and 7. James was old enough to register that something had changed in the household's atmosphere, even if he could not yet articulate what it was. Marina was younger, but no less sensitive to the emotional weather of a home, where the adults were managing a crisis through the only method they knew. Composed silence in public contained distress in private. The family did not fracture in 1973. It absorbed. It adjusted, it redirected its energies into the appearance of normality. That appearance held. But appearances in this family had always been both the greatest strength and the deepest vulnerability. The wider establishment behaved with the ambivalence that characterized its response to the entire Lonrho saga. Heath had condemned the company publicly, but British officialdom also had strategic reason not to destroy an enterprise so deeply embedded in African commerce. Lonrho employed thousands of people across the continent. It maintained relationships with governments that Britain needed to keep on side. It was, in the unsentimental calculus of foreign policy, useful, just as Alexandra was useful to the crown, just as Angus had been useful to the boards he sat on. The system condemned and accommodated at the same time. That double standard would become even more visible when the inspector's report was finally published. Angus attempted, in the years between 1973 and 1976, to rebuild his standing. He remained a director of other companies. He maintained his social connections. He continued to live at Thatched House Lodge with Alexandra and the children. The surface was calm, but beneath it, the Department of Trade investigation was proceeding, and the inspectors were assembling a documentary record that would measure Angus not by the standards of clubland judgment, but by the standards of public accountability. They were reading the board minutes. They were tracing the payments. They were following the money through the shell companies and the offshore arrangements, and they were preparing to publish their findings. The 1973 humiliation was not the end of the scandal. It was the prelude. What came next would be worse because it would move from political rhetoric to documentary particulars: money, structures, the Rhodesian mine, the flat, the 60,000 pounds, and the question of exactly what Angus Ogilvy knew and when he knew it. The phrase had wounded. The report would eviscerate. But before the report, there is the question of Rowland himself: who he was, what he wanted, and why his presence inside the Lonrho story gives it an energy that a purely institutional scandal could never possess. Rowland Walter Furhop was born in 1917 in a British internment camp in India, the son of a German merchant. His early biography is contested in places, but the outlines are clear. He grew up partly in Germany, partly in Britain, was interned during the Second World War as an enemy alien, and eventually made his way to Rhodesia, where he built a business career through a combination of personal magnetism, physical toughness, and an instinct for opportunity that conventional British businessmen found simultaneously impressive and threatening. He changed his name to Tiny Rowland, tiny because of his height, Rowland for reasons that were his own. By the time Angus Ogilvy encountered him in South Africa in 1961, Rowland was already a formidable figure in the white commercial world of Southern Africa, a man who could walk into a room of farmers and miners and convince them to back his next venture before the coffee had gone cold. What made Rowland extraordinary was not merely his commercial talent. It was his refusal to observe the boundaries that the British establishment considered sacrosanct. He did not defer to boards. He did not treat non-executive directors with the reverence that their class expected. He did not separate business from politics, or politics from personal relationships, or personal relationships from the deployment of company resources. He operated, in other words, exactly as many successful businessmen in post-colonial Africa operated, through networks of personal loyalty, through direct engagement with power, through an understanding that in countries where institutions were young and fragile, the man who could deliver results to a head of state was worth more than any number of properly constituted board resolutions. This approach built Lonrho into one of the largest companies operating in Africa. It also made the company a vessel for practices that could not survive the scrutiny of a Department of Trade investigation. The dynamic between Angus and Rowland was, in miniature, the dynamic between old establishment Britain and the new, rougher capitalism that was emerging in the post-imperial world. Angus brought respectability, Rowland brought results. For a time, each needed what the other offered. Angus's name on the board told institutional investors that Lonrho was sound. Rowland's deals told the market that Lonrho was profitable. The arrangement worked as long as no one looked too closely at the methods, and as long as the profits kept flowing, there was very little incentive to look. The breakdown, when it came, was not ideological, it was practical. The non-executive directors became convinced that Rowland was running the company as a personal fiefdom, that decisions were being made without proper board approval, that funds were being directed through channels that lacked transparency, that the company's governance structure had been hollowed out by one man's dominance. Whether their concerns were motivated primarily by principle or by frustration at their own marginalization is a question that reasonable observers have answered differently. What is not in dispute is that by early 1973, the non executive directors had decided that Rowland had to go. The boardroom confrontation that followed was among the most dramatic in British corporate history. It was not a polite disagreement resolved over sherry. It was a war, conducted through emergency board meetings, legal challenges, appeals to shareholders, and a degree of personal animosity that shocked even the city's most seasoned observers. Rowland treated the attempt to remove him as a personal betrayal. He fought with every weapon available: charm, threat, direct appeal to the shareholders who had profited from his leadership, and a willingness to make the conflict public in ways that the gentlemanly culture of the boardroom found deeply uncomfortable. Angus, for his part, found himself in the unfamiliar position of the insurgent, the man challenging established authority rather than embodying it. It was a role for which his entire upbringing had left him poorly equipped. He was not built for combat. He was built for stewardship. And stewardship, in a fight with Tiny Rowland, was not enough. The shareholders backed Rowland. The motion to remove him as managing director failed. The non-executive directors were left exposed, their challenge repudiated, their authority diminished, their names now publicly associated with a corporate battle that had drawn the attention of press, parliament, and public. Angus resigned from the Lonrho board in the aftermath. The resignation was both principled and pragmatic. He had tried to dislodge Rowland and failed. Remaining on the board after that failure would have been untenable. But the resignation did not end his association with the scandal. It merely changed its character. He was no longer a current director of a controversial company. He was a former director of an infamous one. It was at this moment, the spring of 1973, with the boardroom coup defeated and the company's dirty laundry now visible to anyone reading the financial pages, that Edward Heath delivered the judgment that fused Lonrho to political history. The Prime Minister's phrase, "the unpleasant and unacceptable face of capitalism," then was not improvised. It was delivered in the House of Commons during a debate with the weight and deliberation that a parliamentary statement carries. And it did something that no boardroom resolution could have achieved. It made Lonrho a symbol. Not just a company with governance problems, not just a firm under investigation, a symbol of an entire system's failure to police itself. For Angus, the phrase was professionally annihilating in a way that a private reprimand could never have been. A permanent undersecretary's quiet word in 1968 could be absorbed and forgotten. A prime minister's public condemnation in the Commons could not. The words entered the language, they were quoted, reprinted, anthologized. They became shorthand for corporate excess. And attached to those words, however unfairly, was the name of every director who had sat on the Lonrho board during the period in question. Angus Ogilvy was one of them. The months following the Heath denunciation formed a strange interregnum for the family. Angus was no longer at Lonrho, but Lonrho was very much still attached to him. The newspapers had the phrase, the public had the association, and Alexandra, who had spent a decade building a reputation for quiet, unblemished royal duty, now occupied a marriage whose other half had become publicly controversial. She did not comment. She did not withdraw from engagements. She did not cancel a single visit, postpone a single tour, or deviate by a single degree from the course her life had always followed. She continued. Because continuing was what her entire formation had prepared her to do. But the interior cost of that continuing, the private weight of reading the morning papers and knowing that the man at the other end of the breakfast table was now a figure of public embarrassment rather than public admiration, belongs to the part of this story that the family's code of silence had always kept hidden. At Thatched House Lodge, the children were 9 and 7. James was old enough to absorb the household's changed atmosphere, even if the precise details of board resolutions and parliamentary debates were beyond him. Marina was younger, but no less attuned to the emotional weather of a home where the adults were managing something difficult through the only method they knew: composure, silence, and the determined maintenance of routine. The family did not fracture in 1973. It absorbed, it adjusted. It rearranged itself around the wound. That ability to absorb without fracturing was both the family's greatest achievement and the quality that would prove most damaging in the long run, because it meant that nothing was ever fully processed, nothing fully discussed, nothing brought into the open where it might be examined, understood, and released. The dynamics inside the household during this period can be inferred, if not fully documented. Angus was a proud man. He had declined an earldom. He had insisted on a career. He had built an identity on the proposition that he was more than a royal appendage. Now, the career that was supposed to distinguish him had instead disgraced him, or at least had brought him dangerously close to disgrace. The psychological effect of that reversal on a man of his background and temperament should not be underestimated. He was not the sort of man who would rage or weep or make scenes. He was the sort of man who would sit in his study at Thatched House Lodge, with the curtains drawn against the summer evening and the park stretching away beyond the window, and he would read the papers, and he would say nothing, and he would carry the weight of what had happened in the only way he knew how. Internally, silently, was the composure that his class considered both a virtue and a requirement. Alexandra would have understood this because she carried her own burdens in precisely the same way. There is a particular kind of marital solidarity that consists not of communication, but of parallel endurance. Two people in the same house, bearing the same pressure, managing it through the same method of composed silence, each aware that the other is suffering and each unable to offer the kind of open comfort that their training had made impossible. That was the Ogilvy marriage in the mid-1970s. Not broken, not hostile, not even in any conventional sense trouble. Simply two people whose shared code of emotional restraint had become, in the face of a real crisis, both their bond and their prison. The children observed this. Children always do. James, approaching adolescence, was developing the self-contained quality that would characterize his adult life, a quality that reads from the outside as healthy reserve, but that may equally reflect the lessons of a household where emotional expression was managed rather than encouraged. Marina, a few years behind, was beginning to show signs of a different response. She was more openly emotional, more willing to push against the constraints that the household imposed, more likely to test what happened when the surface was disturbed. These were not yet conflicts, they were tendencies, visible only to those who were paying close attention. But they were the first stirrings of a pattern that would, 15 years later, produce a very public rupture. The wider British establishment responded to the Lonrho affair with the double standard that characterized its relationship with post-imperial business throughout this period. Heath had condemned the company in ringing moral terms. But British officialdom also had strategic reason not to destroy an enterprise so deeply embedded in African commerce. Lonrho employed thousands across the continent. It maintained relationships with governments that Britain wanted to keep on side. It provided a commercial infrastructure in countries where the alternative to Lonrho's operations was often no operations at all. A scholarly analysis of the affair has observed that the condemnation was genuine, but that the system also needed what Lonrho provided. The company existed in a space that was simultaneously denounced and tolerated, condemned in parliamentary language and accommodated in diplomatic practice. That ambiguity is important because it helps explain why the scandal did not end with Heath's phrase. It continued through investigation, through the inspector's meticulous accumulation of evidence, toward a reckoning that would be far more specific and far more personally devastating than anything a prime minister could deliver from the dispatch box. Angus attempted, in the years between the boardroom defeat and the publication of the inspector's report, to rebuild his standing. He remained a director of other companies. He maintained his social connections. He continued to live at Thatched House Lodge with Alexandra and the children. The surface held. But the Department of Trade investigation was proceeding beneath it, and the inspectors were assembling a documentary record that would judge Angus not by clubland standards, but by the standards of public accountability. They were reading the board minutes. They were tracing the payments. They were examining the shell structures and the offshore arrangements. They were mapping the £60,000 that Rowland had paid to Angus, and they were preparing to publish findings that would measure what a royal husband had known, what he had missed, and what that failure had cost the public interest. Angus knew the investigation was underway. He could not have been ignorant of it. The Department of Trade inquiry into Lonrho had been announced publicly, debated in Parliament, and reported in the press. He knew that the inspectors would examine his tenure on the board, his role in the boardroom struggle, and the financial arrangements between himself and Rowland. He knew that the report, when it came, would be public. And he knew that whatever it said about him would be read not as a judgment on a businessman, but as a judgment on a man whose wife was the Queen's cousin. The waiting was its own kind of punishment. 3 years of knowing that the evidence was being assembled, 3 years of maintaining a public life, attending dinners, sitting on boards, appearing at the right events, while the inspectors worked through the documents that might dismantle everything. 3 years during which Alexandra continued her engagements and the children continued their education, and the household at Thatched House Lodge continued to function with the immaculate regularity of a family that had been trained never to let the cracks show. The cracks were there. They were simply invisible to anyone who did not live inside that house. The phrase had wounded the family. The report, when it arrived in the summer of 1976, would do something worse. It would itemize. The report arrived in July 1976. It was a Department of Trade inspector's report, which means it was written in the language of administrative inquiry, measured, precise, deliberately stripped of rhetorical flourish, and for exactly those reasons more devastating than any newspaper editorial could have been. Rhetoric can be dismissed as opinion. An inspector's report carries the weight of documentary evidence, sworn testimony, and the authority of the state. When the report criticized Sir Angus Ogilvy, it did so not in the language of moral condemnation, but in the language of assessed fact. He was negligent, the inspectors concluded, to an extent that merits severe criticism. That phrase, like severe criticism, landed with a force disproportionate to its bureaucratic tone, because it was attached to a man whose entire professional identity had been built on the proposition that he could be trusted to exercise proper judgment. There is something about the publication of a government report that differs from every other kind of public exposure. A newspaper story can be denied. A political speech can be dismissed as partisan. A rumor can be weathered. But a report, printed, bound, laid before Parliament, available to any member of the public who cares to read it, like as a different order of revelation, it does not argue, it documents, it does not accuse, it records. And the recording, because it is conducted in the dry, neutral language of administrative inquiry, carries a credibility that more passionate forms of denunciation cannot match. When the Lonrho inspector's report was published, it did not shout. It presented. And the presentation was meticulous. The particulars of the criticism were specific, which made them harder to deflect than the generalized condemnation that Heath had offered 3 years earlier. The report examined the £60,000 that Tiny Rowland had paid to Angus, a payment whose nature and purpose became the subject of intense public scrutiny. It examined the Rhodesian mining interest that had triggered the Greenhill intervention in 1968, tracing the connections between subsidiary companies and the sanctions regime that the British government had imposed. It examined the corporate structures and the shell companies, the subsidiary arrangements, the offshore entities through which Lonrho's more sensitive transactions had been conducted. It examined arrangements regarding a flat that had been made available through Lonrho's corporate machinery. And it examined the question that lay beneath all the specific findings. What had the non-executive directors known about these arrangements? What should they have known? And what did their failure to know reveal about the quality of governance at a company of Lonrho's scale and political sensitivity? For Angus, the most damaging aspect of the report was not any single finding, but the cumulative picture it painted. He was not accused of dishonesty. He was not accused of deliberate wrongdoing. He was accused of something that in many ways was worse for a man of his background, a failure of attention. The inspectors concluded that he had not exercised the level of scrutiny that his position required. He had trusted when he should have questioned. He had accepted when he should have examined. He had been, in the precise and devastating language of the report, negligent. And the negligence was not minor. It merited severe criticism. The kind of criticism that, in the coded language of British official inquiry, means something close to professional disqualification. The timing of the report's publication compounded its impact. July 1976. Britain was in the grip of an economic crisis that would lead, within months, to the humiliation of an IMF bailout. The country was hot. That summer produced one of the most severe droughts in modern British history, and the political temperature matched the weather. The public mood was hostile to privilege, hostile to the establishment, hostile to the kind of cozy arrangements between old money families and the corporate world that the Lonrho report laid bare. In a different year, the report might have been absorbed more quietly. In 1976, it landed in an atmosphere primed for outrage. The parliamentary discussion that surrounded the report's publication was brutal. When the Lonrho findings were debated in the House of Commons on August 4th, 1976, the language used by members of parliament went well beyond the measured tones of the inspectors. Hansard preserved speeches in which MPs treated the affair as evidence of something rotten at the intersection of British capitalism and post-imperial Africa. The words used and sanctions flouting, questionable conduct, arrangements designed to avoid scrutiny, payments that could not be justified by ordinary commercial considerations, were weapons deployed not merely against the company, but against the entire culture of establishment oversight that had permitted the company to operate as it had. Some members went further, describing the sanctions-related behavior in language that approached accusations of treason. That was rhetoric rather than formal allegation, but it reflected the intensity of feeling that the report had provoked. Lonrho was not just a failing company. It was a symbol of a system's failure to hold its own members accountable. And Angus Ogilvy, named in the report, criticized by the inspectors, married to the Queen's cousin, was the most personally exposed figure in the entire affair. He was not present in the Commons chamber when the debate took place. He was not a member of Parliament. He could not respond, rebut, or defend himself in the forum, where his reputation was being discussed with the vehemence of a criminal trial. He could only wait at Thatched House Lodge, presumably, or in the London flat, or wherever a man whose life has just been dismantled by a government report goes to sit with the aftermath. The waiting itself was a kind of torture peculiar to the British system. The knowledge that your name is being spoken in a place where you have no right of reply, by people who are protected by parliamentary privilege from any legal consequence of what they say, and that their words are being recorded in Hansard where they will remain, searchable and quotable, for as long as the parliamentary record endures. The immediate consequences were swift and visible. Angus resigned from 16 directorships. 16. That number deserves emphasis because it represents not merely a contraction of a business portfolio, but the demolition of an entire professional identity. Each of those directorships had been a marker of standing, a signal of trustworthiness, a brick in the edifice of establishment respectability that Angus had spent 20 years constructing. They fell away in days. The man who had declined an earldom because he wanted to be known for his independent achievements was now known for something else entirely, and the speed with which the corporate world distanced itself from him revealed a truth that the establishment prefers not to acknowledge. The system's loyalty to its members is conditional. When the embarrassment exceeds the benefit of association, the association is severed without sentiment. Angus had been valuable to those boards when his name signaled probity. Now his name signaled scandal, and the invitations ceased with the same quiet efficiency with which they had once been extended. The mechanism of distancing was, in its way, as telling as the scandal itself. No one made speeches about dropping Angus Ogilvy. No one issued statements explaining why his presence on a board had become untenable. The directorships simply ended. The letters were written. The minutes of the next meeting recorded a different list of names. The establishment's method of excommunication was the same as its method of inclusion, silent, understood, requiring no explanation because the codes were shared by everyone involved. Angus knew what the resignations meant. The boards knew what they meant. Alexandra knew what they meant. The only people who needed it explained with those outside the system, and those people had never mattered to the system in the first place. The report's publication forced into the open a question that the Greenhill episode of 1968 had raised privately. Where was the boundary between the Crown's interest and Angus's? The palace issued no statement. It did not need to. The absence of a statement was itself a communication, a silence that every observer who understood the royal system could interpret with precision. The Crown was not defending Angus. It was not attacking him. It was allowing the distance between the institution and the individual to become visible. That distance had always existed. It was built into the architecture of the relationship between the royal family and the men who married into it. Angus had been admitted to the family, but never absorbed by it. He remained, in the palace's institutional grammar, a civilian, useful when respectable, expendable when compromised. The report made that calculus unmistakable. Alexandra's response was, characteristically, an intensification of the same behavior that had defined her entire public life. She worked, she appeared at engagements, she fulfilled her duties with the precision of someone for whom duty was not a choice, but a physiological function, as automatic and as necessary as breathing. The court circular continued to record her movements with the bureaucratic exactitude of an institution that does not acknowledge the personal circumstances of the people it deploys. Overseas tours, patronage visits, regimental dinners, hospital openings. The rhythm did not pause, did not slow, did not accommodate the fact that the woman performing these functions was living through the most humiliating period of her married life. There is no record of a cancelled engagement, no record of a public withdrawal, no record of a visible moment of distress. To the world outside Thatched House Lodge, Princess Alexandra was precisely what she had always been: composed, warm, tireless, and apparently untouched by the chaos that surrounded her husband's name. Whether that appearance reflected genuine equanimity or the most disciplined performance of composure in the modern history of the royal family is a question that the family's code of silence forecloses. What can be said, with something approaching certainty, is that the survival of Alexandra's public image was not accidental. It was the product of a lifetime of training. The training that began with Marina's widowhood, that continued through Heathfield in the early years of public duty, that was reinforced by every institution Alexandra inhabited. The royal family does not permit its members to be seen breaking, and Alexandra, who had internalized this prohibition more completely than almost any other royal of her generation, did not break. She bent, she absorbed, she continued, and the continuing was both the most admirable and the most troubling thing about her response, because it meant that the emotional cost of the scandal was borne entirely in private, processed through mechanisms that the outside world could not observe and that the family's own culture did not encourage anyone to examine. Angus, by contrast, was visibly diminished. Not broken, he was too well bred, too deeply schooled in the arts of composed endurance to break in any way that the public could detect, but reduced. The confident city figure of the 1960s, the man who strode through boardrooms and dining rooms with the assurance of someone who belonged in every room he entered, was now a man who had been publicly told, in the language of government-appointed inspectors, that his oversight of a major company had been severely deficient. The psychological weight of that judgment on a man of his class and temperament should not be underestimated. In the world Angus inhabited, reputation was not merely important, it was constitutive. It was the thing from which all other standing derived. Without it, the directorships were meaningless. Without the directorships, the independent identity he had fought to preserve was hollow. And without that identity, what remained? A younger son, a royal husband, a man defined by what he had married rather than what he had achieved. The months after the report were the quietest period of Angus's adult life. He retreated, not dramatically, not ostentatiously, but with the measured withdrawal of a man who understood that his presence in certain rooms was no longer welcome and that his absence from those rooms was the most dignified response available to him. He spent time at Thatched House Lodge. He spent time in the gardens. He spent time, one imagines, in the particular solitude of a man whose peers have stepped back from him with the wordless efficiency that the British upper class perfects when one of its members has become inconvenient. The telephone would have stopped ringing with certain kinds of calls. The post would have thinned. The dinner invitations would have become less frequent, then less grand, then confined to the loyal few who either did not care about the scandal or valued the friendship more than the risk of association. These are small details, but they constitute the daily reality of social disgrace in the world Angus occupied, and they are far more punishing than any formal sanction because they are administered by friends rather than by authorities. 18 months later, according to the account preserved in his obituary, Angus's name was effectively cleared. The precise mechanism of that clearing whether through a further review, a subsequent finding, or the gradual recalibration of opinion as the initial fury subsided, is less well documented than the original condemnation. That asymmetry is itself significant. The accusation made headlines, the clearing did not. The accusation was debated in Parliament. The clearing was noted, if at all, in the back pages. The accusation attached itself to every future mention of Angus Ogilvy's name. The clearing existed as a footnote that required someone to look for it. What his obituary records, with a plainness that carries more emotional weight than any elaboration could achieve, is this: the damage was done. That sentence is one of the most important in the entire story. It captures in 6 words the way that establishment scandal operates in Britain. The formal process may vindicate. The informal process, yeah, but the process of reputation, of whispered judgment, of invitations quietly discontinued, and telephone calls not returned, does not. Angus may have been cleared in the bureaucratic sense. In the social sense, in the sense that mattered to a man of his world, the mark was permanent. He had been named, he had been criticized, he had been publicly associated with negligence in a scandal that a prime minister had called the unacceptable face of capitalism. No subsequent finding, however favorable, could unwrite those words from Hansard or remove the inspector's report from the shelves of the public record. Rowland, meanwhile, continued. That is one of the saga's bitterest ironies. The man who had built the machine that damaged Angus was not himself destroyed by the inspector's report or by the parliamentary fury that accompanied it. Rowland survived because he had never depended on the establishment's approval in the way that Angus had. His power base was commercial, not reputational. His relationships were with African presidents and shareholders, not with Pall Mall clubs and royal households. The report criticized the company. Parliament denounced it, and Lonrho continued to operate, continued to expand, continued to generate the profits that kept Rowland in a position of corporate dominance for decades to come. He would go on to acquire the Observer newspaper in 1981, adding media influence to his existing commercial empire. And he would spend the next 2 decades as one of the most controversial figures in British business life, admired by some for his energy and vision, detested by others for his methods, and largely indifferent to the opinions of both camps as long as the deals kept flowing. The contrast between Rowland's survival and Angus's diminishment is instructive because it reveals something fundamental about the structure of British establishment power. The establishment punishes its own more harshly than it punishes outsiders, because its own have violated a trust that outsiders never held. Rowland was never expected to be honorable in the establishment sense. He was a self-made man, a foreigner by origin, a figure from the rough and tumble world of African commerce who operated by his own rules and made no pretense of subscribing to the gentlemanly code that governed city boardrooms. His disgrace, such as it was a commercial matter, a question of profit and loss, shareholders and regulators. Angus's disgrace was personal, social, and quasi-constitutional. He had failed not merely as a director, but as a representative of a world that was supposed to be above failure. The punishment for that kind of failure is not legal. It is existential. The years between 1978 and the late 1980s are the quietest period in this story, which does not mean they were uneventful. They were the years during which the family settled into its new shape, the shape that the Lonrho scandal had imposed. Angus found ways to remain active in business on a reduced scale, maintaining his involvement with selected companies and enterprises. He was not idle, he was not destroyed, but the grandeur was gone. The portfolio of 16 directorships, the association with the Drayton Empire, the sense of a man whose business reach matched his wife's royal standing, all of that belonged to a previous chapter. What remained was something smaller, quieter, and marked by the particular sadness of a man who had been forced to accept that his peak had passed, and that the event which ended it was not a natural decline, but a public humiliation. Alexandra, through these years, continued to accumulate the engagements that would eventually make her one of the most prolific working royals in British history. She supported over 100 patronages. She visited countries across the Commonwealth and beyond. She represented the sovereign at independence ceremonies, state funerals, and diplomatic occasions with the tireless professionalism that had become her defining characteristic. If the Lonrho scandal had damaged her private world, her public world showed no trace of it. She was, in the eyes of the court circular and the tabloid press and the charity committees who valued her presence, exactly what she had always been: reliable, warm, and utterly beyond reproach. The marriage endured through these years in the particular way that certain establishment marriages endure, not through passionate renewal or therapeutic confrontation, but through the shared understanding that the alternative to endurance was unthinkable. Divorce, for a woman in Alexandra's position, was not merely a personal decision, it was an institutional catastrophe. The royal family of the late 1970s and early 1980s had not yet absorbed the divorce revolution that would reshape the House of Windsor in the 1990s, when the marriages of three of the Queen's four children would disintegrate publicly. Alexandra's generation did not divorce, it persevered. Whether the perseverance was sustained by genuine affection, by shared duty, by mutual dependence, or by the simple absence of any acceptable alternative is a question that the family has never answered publicly, and that the evidence does not permit anyone outside the family to answer with confidence. What is visible is the outcome. They stayed together in the same house, appearing at the same events, presenting to the world the same image of composed partnership that they had presented since 1963. The image was thinner now, but it held. The family reorganized around this new reality with the quiet efficiency of a household that had been managing crises through silence and routine for years. Angus did not disappear from public life entirely. He remained at Thatched House Lodge. He maintained certain business interests. He accompanied Alexandra on selected engagements. He was knighted. The KCVO he received recognizing his service, or perhaps acknowledging in the coded language of royal honors that the institution had not entirely abandoned him. But the terms of his public identity had changed permanently. He was no longer the businessman who happened to be married to a princess. He was the man who had been disgraced and then partially rehabilitated, whose wife's continued prominence served as a daily reminder of what his own prominence had once been, and whose household had survived a crisis that would have ended many marriages, not because the marriage was strong in the conventional sense, but because the code that governed both partners made public failure impossible and private reckoning unnecessary. The children, by 1978, were 14 and 12. They were not young enough to be shielded from what had happened and not old enough to fully process it. James, entering his teenage years with the reserved temperament that would define his adult life, appeared to absorb the lesson that the household had modeled. Control yourself, manage appearances, do not let the private become public. He would carry this forward into an adult life characterized by privacy, professionalism, and a deliberate avoidance of the kind of public visibility that had destroyed his father's career. He went to school at Eton, following the Ogilvy family tradition, and later to the University of St. Andrews, a choice that placed him inside the Scottish aristocratic educational pipeline without the London intensity that had shaped his father's early ambitions. He would emerge from that education not as a city figure or a corporate director, but as something quieter and more self-determined, a landscape designer, a man whose professional life was defined by physical spaces rather than boardroom tables, and by gardens rather than company reports. Marina absorbed a different lesson, or rather, she absorbed the same lesson and over the course of her adolescence and early adulthood, rejected it. She was growing into a young woman whose emotional register ran higher than the household's thermostat was designed to accommodate. She was more openly expressive than her brother, more volatile in her responses, more inclined to push against boundaries that the family's code treated as inviolable. The difference was not dramatic in childhood. It did not manifest as rebellion or defiance in any form that the outside world could observe. It was subtler than that, a quality of emotional transparency that set her apart from the family's dominant style. In a household that valued composure above almost everything, Marina's inability or unwillingness to maintain constant composure was itself a kind of dissent, even when it was not intended as such. There is something about families that have been through scandal that creates a particular pressure on the children who grow up in its aftermath. The pressure is not necessarily to achieve or to compensate. It is to maintain, to preserve the surface that the parents reconstructed after the crisis, to protect the appearance of normality that cost so much to create, to carry the family's restored respectability forward into the next generation without introducing any new source of embarrassment. That pressure is invisible to the outside world. It operates not through explicit instruction, but through atmosphere, through the responses that are rewarded and the responses that are met with silence, through the unspoken understanding that certain topics are not discussed, certain emotions are not displayed, certain kinds of behavior are expected, and certain kinds are not. James appears to have accepted that pressure as natural. Marina appears to have experienced it as suffocating. The signs were not yet alarming. They were merely different. In a family that prized uniformity of response, difference was itself a form of transgression. What neither child could have articulated at that age, but what both would spend their adult lives responding to, was the central paradox of their upbringing. They had been raised inside a system designed to protect them, to insulate them from the rougher world beyond the park gates, to provide them with the advantages of royal connection and aristocratic heritage, to equip them with the manners, the education, and the social capital necessary to navigate British life at its highest levels. And that same system had failed to protect their father from the consequences of his own world's corruption, had failed to provide the children with an honest account of what had happened, and had taught them that the appropriate response to pain was not expression, but suppression. The system had done what it was designed to do. It had maintained appearances. The cost was borne by the people inside it. There is a term in psychology for what happens when a family's stated values and its actual behavior are in permanent contradiction. It is called a double bind. The Ogilvy household in the years after Lonrho embodied a double bind with unusual precision. The stated value was honesty, duty, and integrity, the values that both the royal and the aristocratic traditions held as paramount. The actual behavior was concealment, management, and the suppression of any truth that threatened the appearance of propriety. The children grew up inside that contradiction. One of them would accept it, one of them would not. Through the early and mid 1980s, the household at Thatched House Lodge settled into a pattern that from the outside looked entirely ordinary by the standards of its world. Alexandra continued her public duties. Angus pursued his reduced business interests. James went to university and began thinking about a career. Marina, growing through her late teens, navigated the peculiar social territory that belonged to young women of her background, the territory between royal adjacency and civilian life, between the expectations of the court circular and the desires of a young person who wanted to live on her own terms. It was, by the standards of the tabloid-drenched 1980s, a remarkably quiet household. The newspapers that feasted on the marriages and scandals of the Prince and Princess of Wales, on the Duchess of York's missteps, on the slow public disintegration of the Queen's children's marriages, had very little to say about Princess Alexandra and her family. That silence was not accidental. It was the family's greatest achievement and its most carefully maintained defense. The silence would hold for 13 years after the inspector's report. 13 years in which the family appeared to have absorbed the Lonrho scandal, processed it, survived it, and moved beyond it. 13 years during which Alexandra's reputation not only survived but deepened. She became, in the language of royal commentary, a national treasure, a woman whose decades of service had earned her an admiration that transcended the usual tabloid categories of approval and disapproval. 13 years during which Angus faded from public attention, which was, in its way, a form of mercy. The mercy of being forgotten, of having the scandal recede into the background noise, of an era that was producing newer and louder scandals at an accelerating rate. The corporate scandal was over. The marriage had survived. The household still functioned. Alexandra still departed each morning for her engagements, with the punctuality of a woman for whom timekeeping was a moral imperative. The deer still grazed in the park. The rooms at Thatched House Lodge still smelled of furniture polish and cut flowers, and the particular quiet of a house where loud emotions are not welcome. Everything looked the same. Nearly everything was different. And the difference would not surface through another inspector's report or another parliamentary debate. It would surface through the family's own daughter in an act of public defiance that echoed the Lonrho crisis in register, if not in substance. A second scandal that confirmed to anyone still paying attention that the family's methods of containment could suppress a crisis, but could not prevent the suppressed material from emerging somewhere else, in someone else, in a form that the original architects of the containment would find both unfamiliar and unbearable. The autumn of 1989. Britain was on the cusp of a new decade, and the old certainties were fraying everywhere. The Berlin Wall would fall in November. Margaret Thatcher, who had governed for a decade with an authority that seemed unshakable, was entering the final phase of her premiership, challenged from within by the very forces of ambition and disloyalty that she had spent years deploying against others. The royal family, which had enjoyed a relatively stable public image through most of the 1980s, the Wales marriage aside, was about to enter its most turbulent period since the abdication crisis. And at Thatched House Lodge in the quiet of Richmond Park, the family that had survived one scandal through silence was about to discover that silence, as a strategy, has a shelf life. Marina Ogilvy was 23 years old. She had grown up inside the extended royal family, but never quite of it, close enough to the center to be occasionally photographed, far enough from the line of succession to be largely ignored by the press that obsessed over her more prominent relatives. She was not a working royal in the way her mother was. She did not appear in the court circular. She did not carry out engagements on behalf of the sovereign. She was, in the taxonomy of royal Britain, a private person with a famous connection, free in theory to live as she chose, constrained in practice by a set of expectations that were no less powerful for being unwritten. Her childhood and adolescence had been shaped by the particular atmosphere of Thatched House Lodge in the years after the Lonrho report. An atmosphere of composed endurance, of emotions managed rather than expressed, of a household that functioned with impressive regularity while carrying invisible damage. She had absorbed the knowledge that her father had been publicly humiliated, even if the precise details of the inspector's findings were not discussed at the dinner table. She had watched her mother leave for engagements each morning with the same disciplined punctuality, returning each evening to a house where the air was heavy with things unsaid. She had learned, by observation rather than instruction, the family's central lesson: appearances matter more than feelings. The surface must be maintained. Marina did not want to maintain the surface, or rather, she had maintained it for 23 years and found that the maintenance was costing her something she could not continue to pay. She was pregnant. The father was Paul Mowat, her boyfriend, a photographer who moved in the circles that surrounded but did not fully overlap with the royal world. He was not aristocratic. He was not from the network of families that Alexandra and Angus's world considered appropriate. He was a civilian in the most complete sense of the word, and the pregnancy was unplanned, or at least unplanned in the way that the family's code required. No engagement, no announcement in the Times, no orderly progression through the established rituals by which a woman of Marina's background was supposed to arrive at motherhood. Instead, there was a pregnancy, a boyfriend, and a young woman who chose to make the situation public in a way that her family had not anticipated and could not control. What happened next is contested, and the contest is itself the most revealing thing about it. Marina went to the press. That decision, the decision to speak publicly about her family's response to her pregnancy, was an act of such radical departure from the Kent Ogilvy Code that it is difficult to overstate its significance within the family. This was not a calculated media strategy. It was an emotional eruption. The moment when a young woman who had been raised inside a system of containment decided that she could no longer be contained. Marina told journalists that her parents had pressured her. She alleged that they had urged her to terminate the pregnancy, or to marry Paul Mowat quickly, or to find some other arrangement that would prevent the spectacle of an unmarried daughter of Princess Alexandra having a baby in the full view of the British press. She described a household in which respectability was valued above emotional honesty, in which the appearance of propriety was more important than the well-being of the people required to maintain it. She said she had been cut off financially or emotionally or both. She said she was frightened. She said she felt alone. The press coverage was immediate and voracious. The tabloid newspaper of late 1980s Britain were at the peak of their power and their appetite for royal scandal. This was the era when the Red Tops had perfected the art of turning private distress into public entertainment, when a single front page could reshape the narrative around a royal figure overnight, when the deference that had once protected the monarchy from media scrutiny had been replaced by an adversarial relationship that treated every crack in the royal facade as an invitation to prise the whole structure apart. Marina's story offered everything the tabloids valued: family conflict, generational warfare, sex, pregnancy, the irresistible spectacle of a young woman defying her establishment parents. The coverage was extensive, invasive, and deeply uncomfortable for a family whose survival strategy had always depended on avoiding exactly this kind of attention. Angus and Alexandra denied Marina's account. They issued a statement, unusual, almost unprecedented, for a family whose instinct in every previous crisis had been silence rather than public response. The statement said that Marina was loved, that she was welcome home, that the characterization of parental pressure was not accurate. They presented themselves as concerned parents whose daughter had made a private matter public, and whose public response was motivated not by the desire to control the narrative, but by the need to correct a version of events that they believed was false. The script does not need to adjudicate between these accounts. The truth of what happened inside Thatched House Lodge during those weeks belongs to the people who lived it, and the conflicting versions suggest that each party experienced the same events through very different emotional prisms. Marina through the lens of a young woman who felt unsupported. Her parents through the lens of people who believed they were offering support in the only way they knew how, and the press through the lens of an industry that profited from the gap between the two accounts. What matters for this story is not who was right. What matters is what the conflict revealed about the family and its methods. And what it revealed was this: the same system that had absorbed the Lonrho scandal through containment, silence, and the careful management of appearances was now confronting a member who would not be contained, would not be silent, and would not permit her life to be managed according to a script she had not written. Marina's decision to go public was not merely a family argument played out in newsprint. It was the return of the repressed, the emergence in the next generation of exactly the kind of uncontrolled emotional expression that the family's entire culture was designed to prevent. The parallels with the corporate scandal are not exact, but they are unmistakable. In both cases, the family's first instinct was to protect the name. In both cases, the mechanism of protection was containment. The attempt to keep embarrassing information private, to manage the narrative, to prevent the gap between the family's public image and its private reality from becoming visible to the outside world. In both cases, the containment failed. In 1976, it failed because government inspectors published their findings and Parliament debated them with the gloves off. In 1989, it failed because a 23-year-old woman decided that her pain mattered more than her parents' reputation. The press, of course, was delighted. The tabloid newspapers of 1989 Britain were in full predatory flower. This was the era of Wapping, of Rupert Murdoch's reshaping of Fleet Street, of a media culture that had become more aggressive, more invasive, and less deferential toward the royal family than at any previous point in the century. Marina's story offered everything the tabloids craved: royal scandal, family conflict, sex, pregnancy, generational warfare, and the irresistible spectacle of a young woman defying her establishment parents in public. The coverage was extensive, intrusive, and deeply uncomfortable for a family whose entire strategy for survival had been predicated on the avoidance of exactly this kind of attention. For Angus, the Marina crisis carried a particular sting that only a man who had already been publicly humiliated could fully understand. He had spent 13 years recovering from the Lonrho scandal, not recovering fully, because full recovery from that kind of institutional disgrace is impossible for a man of his class, but recovering enough to resume a diminished version of the public life he had once led. He had rebuilt something, not the edifice of 16 directorships and the Drayton Empire and the confident stride through the city's most prestigious corridors, but something. A quiet respectability, an ability to appear at events without wincing, a version of himself that, if it lacked the luster of the original, at least possessed a certain battered dignity. Now at 61, he was back in the newspapers, not because of anything he had done, but because of what his daughter had said about him. The charge this time was not negligence. It was something that, for a man of Angus's generation and class, was arguably worse: the accusation of emotional coldness. The suggestion that he had prioritized the family's reputation over his daughter's well-being struck at the heart of everything the family claimed to represent: duty, honor, loyalty, compassion. These were the words that had always surrounded the Kent Ogilvy name. Marina's account suggested that when those values were tested by something genuinely messy, genuinely human, genuinely beyond the family's capacity to manage, the response was not compassion, but control. Whether the accusation was fair is a question that admits no simple answer. Angus and Alexandra were people of their generation, their class, and their formation. They had been raised inside systems that valued composure above expression, that treated emotional restraint not as repression, but as strength, that genuinely believed that maintaining appearances was a form of care, that by protecting the family's public image, they were protecting everyone inside it, including the daughter who was now telling them that the protection felt like a prison. It is entirely possible that Angus and Alexandra believed, with complete sincerity, that they were acting in Marina's best interest when they urged discretion and propriety. It is equally possible that Marina experienced that urging as a form of coercion, as the latest expression of a family culture that had always valued its name above the people who carried it. Both things can be true simultaneously. That is the nature of family tragedy. Alexandra's position was, if anything, even more painful than her husband's. She was the woman who had spent a quarter of a century demonstrating that duty and warmth could coexist, that it was possible to be both a tireless public servant and a genuinely caring presence. Her public persona was built on the warmth. Marina's account threatened to dismantle it. A mother who pressures her pregnant daughter, whatever the specifics of that pressure, is not the warm, compassionate figure that the court circular and the charity committees and the grateful recipients of royal patronage believed Alexandra to be. Whether that characterization captured the full complexity of Alexandra's response to a situation that no amount of royal training could have prepared her for is impossible to determine from outside the family. What is undeniable is that the characterization was public, and that in a family that had survived every previous crisis through silence, the fact of Marina's speech was itself the deepest wound. The weeks that followed were a strange public theater. Marina gave interviews with an emotional directness that was entirely foreign to her family's style. She expressed hurt. She asked for understanding. She said things in public that her mother had been trained never to say and that her father, scarred by Lonrho, had learned never to risk. The family responded with the instruments it possessed, measured statements delivered through proper channels, denying the accusations and affirming their love. The contrast between Marina's emotional transparency and her parents' institutional restraint was visible in every exchange. She spoke as a person in pain. They responded as a family under management. Neither register was insincere. Both were inadequate to the situation. James, 25 by now, and already embarked on the quietly professional adult life that would carry him through the family's turmoil, occupied a position of particular difficulty. He was the son who had absorbed the household's lessons about privacy and restraint. He was the sibling who had not rebelled. His sister's public statements placed him in an impossible position. Too loyal to his parents to endorse Marina's account, too close to his sister to dismiss it entirely, and too well trained in the family's code of silence to say anything at all. He said nothing. His silence was the loudest confirmation of the family's operating system that the crisis produced. The baby, Zanuska, was born in early 1990. Marina and Paul Mowat married in February of that year, in a ceremony that was modest by the standards of the world into which Marina had been born. The wedding was not the Westminster Abbey spectacle that had launched her parents' marriage 27 years earlier. It was smaller, quieter, marked by the complicated emotions of a union formed under pressure and conducted in the aftermath of a very public family rupture. Whether the reconciliation that the wedding implied was genuine or strategic, whether the family had truly healed or had simply reassembled the surface, is another question that the family's privacy conventions prevent anyone from answering with confidence. The marriage would not last. Marina and Paul divorced, adding another layer of fracture to a family that had already accumulated more than its share. A second child, Christian, was born before the marriage ended. The dissolution of the marriage confirmed, for those who cared to observe the pattern, that the crisis of 1989 had not been resolved by the wedding of 1990. It had merely been deferred, managed, pushed below the surface, with the same reflexive efficiency that had characterized the family's response to every previous crisis. Marina's later life became markedly private by the standards of the extended royal family. Having spoken so publicly in 1989, she retreated credito, gradually, and without the kind of announcement that would have attracted further press attention, into a life that the newspaper found difficult to narrate because she gave them almost nothing to work with. Whether that retreat was a choice, a condition of family reconciliation, or simply the exhaustion of someone who had learned the hard way that public speech, in her world, exacted a price that no amount of vindication could offset, remains unclear. What is visible is the trajectory, from the emotional directness of the 1989 interviews to something closer to silence, from public defiance to private withdrawal, from the daughter who broke the family code to the woman who, in her own way and for her own reasons, seemed eventually to observe it. The 1990s were a strange decade for the Ogilvy household. The wider royal family was convulsing. The separations and divorces of Charles and Diana, Andrew and Sarah, Anne and Mark Phillips, the annus horribilis of 1992, the fire at Windsor Castle, the slow grinding public destruction of the Wales marriage culminating in Diana's death in 1997. Against this backdrop of royal chaos, Princess Alexandra and Sir Angus Ogilvy were paradoxically among the more stable members of the extended family. They were still married. They were still at Thatched House Lodge. Alexandra was still performing her duties. The irony was bitter. The couple whose marriage had survived a corporate scandal and a domestic rupture now looked almost reassuringly solid compared to the marriages of the Queen's own children. Stability in the royal family of the 1990s was a relative concept. Angus's health declined through the later 1990s and into the early 2000s. He had always been lean, but age and the accumulated stresses of a life marked by public humiliation and private composure began to show in the way that they show on men of his class and generation. Not dramatically, not with the visible collapse that illness sometimes brings, but with a gradual drawing in, a quietening, a reduction of the physical and social territory that a man occupies in the world. He appeared less frequently at public events. He was seen less in the company of the people who had once constituted his professional and social circle. The smaller post-Lonrho version of his career continued in some form, but the energy that had driven the younger man through scores of directorships and boardroom struggles was fading. He was becoming, in the language that the British use about men of his background, an elder, a figure respected for his longevity rather than his achievements, treated with the gentle deference that the establishment extends to those of its members who have survived their own disgrace. Angus was diagnosed with throat cancer. He was treated. He lived with the illness in the same way he had lived with everything else, privately, without public complaint, with the composed endurance that his class and his wife's class and the overlapping circles of duty and discretion had taught him to regard as the only acceptable response to suffering. He did not give interviews about his health. He did not seek sympathy. He endured. It was what he had always done. It was the only thing the code permitted. The central tragedy of this family's story is not a single death or a single event. It is a pattern of containment, of silence, of the systematic prioritization of reputation over emotional truth, playing out across two registers in two different decades. In 1976, the pattern expressed itself through the corporate world, a scandal managed, a man diminished, a family preserved at the cost of its own honesty. In 1989, the same pattern expressed itself through the domestic world. A daughter's pain managed, a public image defended, a family preserved at the cost of its youngest member's trust in the people who were supposed to protect her. The pattern is the tragedy. The individual events are its symptoms. Consider the two scenes braided together. July 1976. A government report is published. A man reads his own name attached to the words severe criticism. He sits in a house in Richmond Park and begins the process of resigning. From 16 directorships, each resignation, a small surgical removal of the identity he spent 2 decades constructing. His wife leaves for an engagement. His children are in the garden. The household continues to function with the precision of a mechanism that does not acknowledge its own damage. Now cut forward 13 years. Autumn 1989, a young woman, the daughter born in that same house 3 years before the report was published, speaks to the press. She says her parents have failed her. She says the family that presented itself as loving and supportive has chosen appearances over her welfare. Her father, 61 now, reads his daughter's words in the same newspapers that once published the inspector's findings. Her mother, whose public image has survived 3 decades of faultless service without a single visible crack, discovers that the crack has come, not from outside the family, but from within it. From the child she raised, in the house she maintained, according to the code she inherited from her own mother. The two scenes are not identical. One involves government inspectors and sanctions busting and £60,000. The other involves a pregnancy, a boyfriend, and a young woman's refusal to be silenced. But they expose the same mechanism, operating in the same household, across the same family, producing the same result: the protection of the name at the expense of the person. And the cost in both cases falls not on the institution that demanded the protection, but on the individuals who were caught inside it. A husband whose career was destroyed by the gap between his assumed probity and his actual oversight. And a daughter whose faith in her parents was destroyed by the gap between their stated values and their response when those values were truly tested. The mechanism itself deserves examination because it is not unique to this family. It is the mechanism of the British establishment itself. The same system that produced the court etiquette, the school codes, the regimental traditions, the corporate governance structures, and the royal protocols that shaped every person in this story from birth. The mechanism operates according to a simple principle. When a problem arises, the system's first response is not to resolve the problem, but to manage its visibility. The problem may be genuine, urgent, and painful. What threatens the system is not the problem itself, but the perception of the problem. And so the system moves to contain the perception, to keep the difficulty private, to prevent it from reaching the public, to ensure that the face the institution presents to the world remains composed and untroubled, regardless of what is churning behind it. This approach works, often for decades. It works until someone decides that visibility matters more than containment. And when that happens, when an inspector publishes a report, or a daughter speaks to the press, or a princess gives a television interview, the collapse of the containment is invariably more devastating than the original problem would have been, because the gap between the managed surface and the suppressed reality has had years or decades to grow. In the Ogilvy family, the gap had been growing since 1968, since the Greenhill conversation, since the first quiet withdrawal from Rhodesia, since the first demonstration that the family's continuation depended on its ability to control what the public knew. By 1989, the gap was vast. The public saw a stable, admirable, slightly dull branch of the extended royal family, a princess who had never put a foot wrong, and a businessman husband who had weathered some professional difficulties but remained respectable. The reality was a household in which the father carried the permanent mark of public humiliation. The mother sustained her composure through an act of will that left no space for emotional candor. The son had learned to protect himself through study reserve, and the daughter had concluded that the protection the family offered was not protection at all, but a form of confinement dressed as care. This is, in the end, a story about the British establishment at its most characteristic and at its most destructive. The establishment does not destroy people through cruelty. It destroys them through propriety. It does not attack. It manages. It does not punish. It distances. And the people who are damaged by its methods are not its enemies, but its most faithful servants. The people who believed in the code, who lived by it, who trusted that the system would protect them as long as they protected it. Angus Ogilvy believed in the code. He lived by it with a fidelity that was, in retrospect, almost painful. And the code failed him, not because it was false, but because it was designed for a world in which the surfaces never cracked. And the world he actually inhabited was a world in which they did. Alexandra believed in the code too, perhaps more completely than Angus, because her formation had begun earlier and gone deeper. The motherless royal childhood, the Heathfield discipline, the decades of duty performed without visible complaint. She had staked her entire public identity on the proposition that composure and warmth could coexist, that you could suppress private pain without becoming cold, that the surface need not lie about the substance. Marina's rebellion had challenged that proposition with a directness that no inspector's report could match. An inspector could question Angus's competence. Marina questioned her mother's humanity, whether the question was fair, whether Alexandra's response to her daughter's pregnancy was, in context, as cold as Marina's public account suggested, matters less than the fact that the question was asked publicly by the one person whose testimony could not be dismissed as an outsider's misunderstanding. Marina knew she had grown up inside the code. Her critique came from within the walls, and the walls could not hold it. Angus was 61, Alexandra was 53, James was 25, safely launched into the quiet adult life that the household's lessons had prepared him for. Marina was 23, newly married, a mother, and publicly estranged from the family whose code she had broken by speaking. The positions were fixed. The damage was distributed unevenly, as it always is in families, falling heaviest on those who had the least protection and the most need. At Thatched House Lodge, the house that had witnessed both crises continued to stand in its park, as beautiful and as silent as ever. The structure survived. The questions it left behind about what happens to the people who live inside structures built for endurance rather than honesty, about what children inherit when the primary inheritance is a code of silence, about whether a family can survive its own survival mechanisms. Those questions would not be resolved. They would be carried forward into the next decade and the next generation by the people who were left holding the name and its freight of glamour and damage and grief that had never been permitted to speak its own name. The 1990s passed, the 2000s began. Alexandra continued her duties. Angus continued his decline. The children continued their diverging trajectories. James further into privacy and professionalism. Marina further into a withdrawal that mirrored, in its own way, the family's preference for silence. The grandchildren grew. The world changed. The monarchy changed. The culture that had produced the Lonrho scandal and the Green Hill conversation and the gentlemanly codes of the Pall Mall clubs was giving way to something faster, less deferential, less willing to accept that certain arrangements were simply how things were done. And yet, inside Thatched House Lodge, the old codes persisted, because the people who lived there had been formed by them too completely to abandon them, even when the evidence suggested that the codes had failed. The final chapter of this family's story belongs not to the scandal or the daughter's rebellion or the establishment's machinery of distancing. It belongs to what happened afterwards, to the long, slow reckoning that plays out not in boardrooms or newspaper columns, but in hospital rooms and funeral chapels and the quiet houses where the survivors of family damage continue to live with what they have inherited. Angus Ogilvy was 76 years old and dying. The cancer that had been treated, managed, endured in the Ogilvy fashion, silently, composedly, without public complaint, that was reaching its conclusion. And the family that had spent 4 decades managing perceptions was about to face the one event that no amount of composure can control. Sir Angus Ogilvy died on December 26, 2004, at the age of 76. He died at home, which for the Ogilvy family meant Thatched House Lodge. The same house in the same park where the children had grown up, where the inspector's report had been absorbed through silence, where a daughter's public rebellion had been met with a measured statement and a closed door. He died on Boxing Day, which in the British calendar is a day of quiet aftermath, the day after the celebration, the day when the family gathers in its reduced formation and the house is full of wrapping paper and cold turkey and the particular drowsiness of a festival that has passed its peak. It is a day of winding down, and Angus, who had spent 3 decades winding down from the life he had once expected to lead, chose it. Or the cancer chose it for him, as the day on which the endurance finally ended. The death was not unexpected. Angus had been ill for some time. The throat cancer that had been diagnosed, treated, and endured according to the family code, privately, stoically, without public complaint or sympathy seeking, had followed the course that such illnesses follow when they are no longer being held at bay. The final weeks would have been spent in the house with Alexandra, with whatever members of the family were present, in the company of the particular silence that descends on a household when everyone knows what is coming and no one needs to say it. The code that had governed the family's response to every previous crisis, composed, contained, private, would have governed this one too. But there is a difference between managing a corporate scandal through silence and managing a death through silence. The scandal was something done to the family from outside. The death was the most intimate of endings, happening inside the house, to the person around whom the house had organized itself for 4 decades. He was 76. He had been married to Alexandra for 41 years. He had been a father for 40. He had been a figure of public controversy for 31 years, if you dated it from the Heath denunciation, or 28, if you dated it from the inspector's report, or the full span of his adult life, if you accepted that the seeds of the scandal were planted when he first encountered Tiny Rowland in South Africa in 1961 and helped bring him to Lonrho. He had been at various moments a promising young businessman, a royal husband, a company director, a disgraced director, a cleared director whose clearance came too late, a diminished figure on a reduced stage, and an elderly man living quietly in a beautiful house with a wife who never stopped working. The trajectory of his life described an arc that the British establishment produces with some regularity. The arc of the man who is raised to trust the system, is damaged by the system, and spends his remaining years inside the system because it is the only world he knows. Tiny Rowland had died before him in 1998 at the age of 80. That death deserves noting because the contrast between the two men's final acts says something important about what the Lonrho affair ultimately meant. Rowland died wealthy, powerful, and largely unrepentant. He had survived the inspector's report, survived Heath's denunciation, survived the boardroom battle of 1973, survived decades of controversy and accumulated enemies, and died in possession of the kind of fortune and influence that Angus had never come close to achieving. His obituaries treated him as a figure of fascination rather than disgrace. A rogue, perhaps, but a magnificent one. A man whose energy and ambition had reshaped the landscape of African commerce even as his methods had scandalized the establishment. Angus's obituaries, when they came 6 years later, would be gentler, more sympathetic, but also smaller. The obituaries of a man who had been caught in the machinery rather than driving it, who had been damaged by proximity to Rowland's world rather than empowered by it. The contrast illuminates a truth that the establishment prefers not to state openly. The system punishes its own members for association with scandal more harshly than it punishes the outsiders who created the scandal in the first place. The funeral was held on January 5th, 2005 at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. The location was significant. St. George's Chapel is not a parish church. It is a royal chapel, the place where the Order of the Garter is invested, where monarchs are buried, where the most solemn ceremonies of the crown are conducted. To hold Angus's funeral, there was to affirm publicly and unambiguously that whatever the Lonrho scandal had done to his reputation in the wider world, the royal family had not disowned him. The institution that had allowed the distance between itself and Angus to become visible in 1976, the institution that had issued no statement of support during the worst of the inspector's report fallout, was now in death, claiming him back. That reclamation carried a meaning that was simultaneously generous and self-serving. Generous because it honored a man who had suffered. Self-serving because it demonstrated that the institution was, as always, in control of the narrative, deciding when to distance and when to embrace, when to be silent and when to speak, always calibrating its response to serve its own continuity rather than the welfare of any individual member. The obituaries were kinder than the headlines of 1976 had been. They tended to present Angus as a decent man who had been caught up in something larger than himself. A victim of Tiny Rowland's methods rather than an architect of them. A man whose negligence was passive rather than active. Whose failure was one of oversight rather than intention. The Independent's obituary noted the inspector's criticism and the subsequent clearing with the even-handedness of a publication, recording a life rather than prosecuting a case. The overall tone was one of qualified sympathy. The British press's way of acknowledging that a man had suffered without quite absolving him of responsibility for the suffering. Alexandra attended the funeral with the composure that had defined every public appearance of her life. She was 68. She had been married to Angus for longer than many people's entire adult lives. She had shared a household with him through the best years and the worst years, through the building of his career and the demolition of it, through the daughter's rebellion and the son's quiet withdrawal, through the cancer and the decline and the final months in the house in the park. Whatever grief she felt, she processed it according to the code that had governed her existence since childhood. Publicly composed, privately immeasurable, expressed through continued duty rather than visible collapse. The widowhood that followed was, in one sense, simply a continuation of the pattern that had defined Alexandra's entire adult life: service, duty, composure, the subordination of private feeling to public obligation. But in another sense, it was something new. For the first time in 41 years, she was alone in the house. The man whose presence had anchored the domestic side of her existence. The man whose career had given her the most difficult years of her public life, and whose quiet companionship had presumably given her something that the public could not see, was gone. The code required that she carry on. She carried on. She returned to her engagements within a time frame that the press found remarkably, almost disturbingly brief. She was back in the court circular, back at the patronage visits and the regimental dinners and the hospital openings, back in the public role that had been her identity for longer than any scandal or grief or personal loss. There is a question that hangs over Alexandra's widowhood, and it is a question that the code will never permit anyone to answer. Was the carrying on a form of strength or a form of flight? Was the return to duty an expression of resilience? The demonstration that a woman of her caliber could absorb even the loss of a husband without losing her capacity for service? Or was it an evasion of grief, a substitution of public activity for private reckoning, the latest expression of a lifetime spent converting personal pain into institutional productivity? The question is not rhetorical. Both answers are plausible. Both may be true simultaneously. And the inability to distinguish between them, the impossibility of knowing from outside whether composure is genuine or performed, whether carrying on is courage or avoidance, is the central ambiguity of Alexandra's life and of the code she embodies. The years after 2005 saw Alexandra's public role acquire a quality that it had not possessed before, a quality of solitary persistence that was, depending on one's perspective, either inspiring or faintly troubling. She had always worked, but she had always worked as a married woman, as half of a partnership, as someone who returned from her engagements to a household that contained another adult presence, however diminished that presence had become in Angus's final years. Now she worked as a widow, and the work took on a different character, less the shared duty of a royal couple, and more the singular determination of a woman who had decided, consciously or otherwise, that stopping was not an option. She continued to hold more than 100 patronage well into her 80s. She attended events that younger members of the family might have been expected to take over. She appeared at state occasions with the reliability of someone for whom absence would constitute a more dramatic statement than presence. The monarchy, which had quietly reduced the public roles of other aging members, seemed content to let Alexandra continue for as long as she was willing, perhaps recognizing that her willingness was itself a form of value, evidence that the system could produce people of such dedication that they would serve until their bodies simply would not permit it. There was, too, a practical dimension to Alexandra's continued visibility that the family's financial history made relevant. Unlike the senior members of the royal family, Alexandra had never been independently wealthy in a way that would have permitted a comfortable retirement from public life. Angus's career, the career that was supposed to provide the private income that would complement the royal allowance, had been curtailed by the Lonrho scandal and never fully recovered. The financial architecture of the Ogilvy household had always depended on the combination of Angus's city earnings and the institutional support that came with Alexandra's position. When the city earnings diminished, the institutional support became more important. When Angus died, the question of how a princess of modest independent means sustains a life that the public expects to look a certain way became more pressing, though it was never characteristically discussed publicly. Alexandra's continued service was not merely a matter of duty. It was in ways that the family would never acknowledge and the press only occasionally explored, a matter of necessity, the practical consequence of a financial life that the Lonrho scandal had permanently altered. James Ogilvy was 40 at the time of his father's death. He had built exactly the kind of life that the lessons of his upbringing had prepared him for. A life of quiet competence, conducted at a deliberate remove from the public attention that had damaged his father and convulsed his sister. He had studied at the University of St. Andrews. He had become a landscape designer, building a career that expressed the aesthetic sensibility his father had once wanted to channel into architecture. He married Julia Rawlinson in 1988 and built a family life characterized by the privacy that his parents' experience had taught him to value above almost everything. Ogilvy and Co. LLP, the landscape design practice he established, represented a deliberate reorientation of the family name. From the boardroom to the garden, from corporate governance to physical cultivation, from the abstract world of directorships and reputational capital to the tangible world of soil and stone and growing things. Whether that choice was conscious, whether James deliberately chose a profession as far from the city as his education and temperament would allow, is a question he has never publicly addressed. The choice speaks for itself. Marina Ogilvy was 38 when her father died. The relationship between them, strained publicly in 1989, partially repaired in the years that followed through mechanisms that the family has never described, had settled into whatever accommodation they had managed to reach. The press, which had feasted on Marina's rebellion 15 years earlier, had largely moved on. She had become one of the quieter members of the extended royal family, a woman whose most famous act remained the one that had caused the most pain, and whose subsequent life had been conducted with a privacy so complete that the newspapers had almost nothing to report, whether that privacy represented healing or resignation, whether Marina had made peace with the family system or had simply exhausted herself in the effort of opposing it, is not known. What is known is that she attended her father's funeral, and that the attendance itself constituted a kind of statement about where things stood, damaged, endured, not entirely resolved, but present. Still present. The grandchildren, Zanuska Mowat, born in the crisis of 1989, and Christian Mowat, born before the divorce, carried the family forward into a generation that would relate to the Lonrho scandal and the Marina rebellion as history rather than lived experience. Flora Ogilvy, James's daughter, would emerge as the most publicly visible of the grandchildren, educated at the Courtauld Institute. Active in the art world and in philanthropy, she occupied a position in the next generation that echoed Alexandra's combination of royal adjacency and personal distinction. Alexander Ogilvy, James's son, pursued his own path with the privacy that had become the family's defining characteristic. The grandchildren are not the subjects of this story, but they are its inheritors. They carry the name, the connections, and the subtle residue of everything that the name has meant: the royal wedding at Westminster Abbey and the inspector's report laid before Parliament, the 100 patronages and the 16 resigned directorships, the warmth and the silence, and the inability to separate the two. In the wider Ogilvy family, the structures of aristocratic continuity continue to operate according to their own ancient logic. David Ogilvy, Angus's nephew and the son of his elder brother, became the 13th Earl of Airlie after his father's death. He served as Lord Chamberlain to Queen Elizabeth II, continuing the family's tradition of royal service at the highest level. When he died in 2023, the title passed to his son, also David, who became the 14th Earl of Airlie. The earldom, the title that Angus had declined on marriage, the inheritance that had belonged to the elder brother rather than the younger, continued to exist, continued to carry weight inside the British aristocratic system, continued to connect the Ogilvy name to the crown and the court in ways that Angus's Owen branch of the family no longer did in the same way. The persistence of the title, alongside the fading of Angus's branch, carries an irony that needs no elaboration. Angus turned down a title because he wanted to be defined by what he built. The title endured, passing from father to son in the ancient manner. The career he built in its place was eclipsed by the scandal that it attracted. The 13th Earl served as Lord Chamberlain from 1984, with a distinction that was unblemished by the kind of controversy that had marked his uncle's life. He occupied exactly the position that Angus might have occupied had he been the elder son. a life of institutional service, conducted inside the protective architecture of the peerage, insulated from the rougher world of commercial capitalism that proved so dangerous to a man who entered it carrying a famous name and insufficient armor. The cultural afterlife of this story is notable mostly for what does not exist. There is no major film dramatization of the Lonrho scandal. There is no prestige television series examining the entanglement of corporate corruption and royal respectability that defined Angus Ogilvy's public life. In an era when the Crown has dramatized the Windsor family's internal tensions for a global audience, and when the Murdoch Empire has been given its own fictional treatment, the Lonrho Ogilvy intersection remains curiously untouched by popular culture. The scandal appears in histories of post imperial British business, in studies of corporate governance failures, in academic analyses of the relationship between the establishment and African commerce. A Cambridge University press analysis has examined the Lonrho affair in the context of British capitalism's post imperial transition. But the human story, the husband, the wife, the daughter, the house in the park, has not received the narrative treatment that other royal adjacent scandals have attracted. A 2021 television documentary, Princess Alexandra, the Queen's Confidant, offered a portrait of Alexandra's life that acknowledged the difficulties without dwelling on them, a respectful overview that the family's code of discretion would have approved of. The documentary captured the public Alexandra, the decades of service, the warmth, the tireless professionalism. It did not attempt to penetrate the private Alexandra, the woman who managed a corporate scandal and a domestic rupture and a husband's declining health and her own grief through the same mechanism of composed endurance that she had learned from her mother and that her mother had learned from the exigencies of widowed royal life. That restraint was appropriate to the documentary's purpose, but it also illustrated the degree to which Alexandra's public narrative has been permitted to obscure, rather than illuminate, the more complicated reality beneath it. The absence of a searching cultural treatment is itself a reflection of the family's achievement in one specific dimension. They managed to prevent the Lonrho scandal from defining Alexandra's legacy, even if they could not prevent it from defining Angus's. Alexandra is remembered, to the extent that the wider public remembers her at all, as a dutiful princess, a warm presence, a reliable figure in the background of royal events. She is not remembered as the wife of the man at the unacceptable face of capitalism. That separation of her reputation from his is the family's most successful act of narrative management. Whether it is also an injustice, whether Alexandra's involvement in the household's response to the scandal and to Marina's rebellion should be part of her public story as much as the patronages and the tours, is a question that this documentary raises without presuming to answer. This account in its way addresses an imbalance, not to sensationalize or to re-prosecute a case settled decades ago, not to assign blame where the evidence permits only inference, but to examine a pattern that has implications far beyond a single family. The pattern by which the British establishment manages its own failures, the way in which institutional loyalty is conditional on institutional convenience, the cost that is borne by the individuals who find themselves caught between the system's demand for propriety and the world's persistent refusal to be proper. What remains in 2026 is this. Princess Alexandra is 89 years old. She is still, as of the most recent available records, a working member of the royal family, one of the longest serving in British history. Her decades of duty stretching from the reign of her cousin Elizabeth II through the coronation of Charles III, which she attended in May 2023, to the reception marking what would have been Queen Elizabeth's centenary in April 2026. She has outlived her husband by more than 2 decades. She has outlived Tiny Rowland by nearly 3. She has outlived the era that produced the Lonrho scandal, the era of gentlemanly capitalism, of boards constituted on the basis of school and regiment and club, of corporate governance structures that depended on trust rather than transparency. She has lived long enough to see that era replaced by something faster, more regulated, more transparent in its mechanisms, if not always in its outcomes. And she has continued through all of it to perform the role that the monarchy assigned her more than 60 years ago. The reliable cousin, the tireless worker, the woman whose warmth and composure have been offered to the nation as evidence that the system works, even when the system's record suggests otherwise. She is, by any measure, one of the most remarkable women in the modern history of the British monarchy. Not for the drama of her life, which has been largely invisible to the public, but for the sheer sustained duration of her service and the composure with which she has performed it. Over 100 patronages, towers to dozens of countries, decades of hospital visits, regimental dinners, charity events, and state occasions conducted with the professionalism of someone for whom duty is not a choice, but a biological imperative. Whether that composure has been achieved at a cost that only she and her family can calculate is a question that her public record does not answer and that her private code will never permit her to address. James Ogilvy is 62. He lives privately with his family, maintaining the deliberate remove from public attention that his upbringing taught him to value. His landscape design practice continues to operate under the name Ogilvy & Co. LLP, a name that carries in the context of this story a quiet significance. He chose not to abandon the family name. He chose instead to attach it to something new, something built rather than inherited, something that grows rather than depreciates. His daughter Flora, now Flora Vesterberg, after her marriage to Timothy Vesterberg in 2020, has established herself in the art and philanthropic worlds with a confidence that suggests the family's capacity for public engagement has not been permanently impaired by the scandals of previous generations. She studied at the Courtauld Institute and has built a profile that combines aesthetic sophistication with the kind of charitable commitment that echoes, consciously or not, her grandmother's lifetime of patronage. His son Alexander maintains the privacy that the family's history has made almost mandatory. James has navigated the aftermath of his parents' story with a success that is measured not in headlines or public acclaim, but in the absence of both. A life conducted on his own terms, in his own sphere, with a professionalism that honors the best of what his parents represented without repeating their exposure to the forces that nearly destroyed them. There is something worth noting about James's choice of career. Landscape design is at its core an art of patience. You plant a tree knowing that its full beauty will not be visible for decades. You shape a garden understanding that the result of your work will outlive you. You accept that control is limited, that weather, soil, season, and time will determine the outcome as much as any design. It is difficult not to read that professional philosophy as a response to the household in which James was raised, a household in which the attempt to control outcomes, to manage appearances, to shape the world's perception through force of will, had produced results that were the opposite of what was intended. James chose a profession in which you work with natural processes rather than against them. Whether that choice was deliberate or instinctive, it represents a form of wisdom that the previous generation's approach to crisis management conspicuously lacked. Marina Ogilvy is 59. She lives privately. The interviews of 1989 are 37 years in the past, longer ago now than the Lonrho scandal was when Marina gave those interviews. The woman who broke the family code has not, so far as the public record shows, broken it again. She has lived through the decades since 1989 in a silence that mirrors, in an ironic symmetry, the family code she once rejected. Whether that silence represents resolution, a genuine making of peace with the family and its methods, or acceptance, or the particular weariness of someone who discovered that public speech, however cathartic in the moment, does not actually change the system it challenges, is a question that Marina alone can answer and that she has chosen not to. Her children inhabit the next ring of the family's orbit. Zanuska Mowat, now in her mid-30s, has been visible in fashion and society circles. A young woman whose birth coincided with the family's most public domestic crisis, and whose adult life has been conducted at a notable remove from any similar turbulence. Christian Mowat has remained further from public attention, occupying a position in the family constellation that is defined more by privacy than by visibility. Together, the Mowat children represent the complicated inheritance of a household in which the parents' marriage began in scandal and ended in separation, and in which the grandparental legacy includes both royal connection and public humiliation. How they carry that inheritance, whether it weighs on them, whether they have processed it, whether the word Lonrho means anything to them beyond a historical footnote, belongs to a chapter of the story that has not yet been written and may never be. Thatched House Lodge still stands in Richmond Park. The deer still graze the grass outside the windows. The house is no longer the Ogilvy family home. Alexandra moved to other accommodation after Angus's death, though the specifics of that transition are characteristically not matters of public record. The house endures as a physical space, as a location that anyone can see from the past across the park. What happened inside it, the silences, the composure, the managed crises, the unspoken damage, the mornings when Alexandra left for her engagements and Angus stayed behind with his papers and his diminished world, belongs to the people who live there, and they have chosen, with a consistency that spans decades, not to speak of it. What is known is this: a family built on the overlapping codes of royal duty and aristocratic honor was tested twice by crises that exposed the distance between its public face and its private reality. The first crisis was corporate. A scandal that arrived through the boardroom, was amplified by Parliament, and was documented by government inspectors in language that could not be unsaid. The second was domestic, and a daughter's rebellion that arrived through the press and was conducted in the emotional register that the family's code had been designed to suppress. In both cases, the family survived. In both cases, the survival was achieved through the same method: containment, composure, the conversion of private pain into public performance. And in both cases, the cost was borne not by the institution that demanded the survival, but by the individuals who paid for it. In a career destroyed, in trust broken, in grief left without language, in decades of silence that may have been dignity, or may have been something that only resembles dignity from the outside and feels very different from within. The British establishment is at its most characteristic and at its most destructive, not when it is openly hostile, but when it is composed, not when it attacks, but when it manages, not when it punishes, but when it insulates its members so completely from the consequences of honesty that honesty becomes impossible. The code was the first thing this family inherited. It may be the last thing they relinquish.